My name is David Ochoa, and I've been a park ranger at Sonora and Deep Canyon National Monument in southern Arizona for 6 years. I'm 34 years old, originally from Tucson, and I took this job because my father was a ranger here before me, and his father before him. The Ochoa family has been working this stretch of desert since it was designated protected land in 1952. My abuelo used to say the canyon chose us, not the other way around, but I always thought that was just the kind of poetic thing old desert rats say when they've spent too long under the sun. I'm writing this from a hospital in Phoenix, where they're keeping me for observation, even though, physically, I'm fine. They keep asking me questions I don't know how to answer. The psychiatrist they sent thinks I'm experiencing a shared delusion with my partner, some kind of folie à deux brought on by isolation and heat stress. Maybe she's right. Maybe everything I'm about to describe happened only in our heads. A mutual hallucination born from spending too much time in a landscape that doesn't care if you live or die. But I don't think so. I think we heard something real in that canyon, something that's been there longer than my family has been watching over it, and I think it's still there now, waiting for the next person curious enough or foolish enough to listen. Sonoran Deep is not like the Grand Canyon or any of the famous desert landmarks tourists flock to. It's a narrow slice of protected wilderness in the Sonoran Desert, centered around a geological oddity, a canyon that drops nearly 800 feet in less than a quarter mile, creating a microclimate at the bottom that's radically different from the desert floor. While the surface bakes at 110 degrees in summer, the canyon bottom stays relatively cool, fed by a spring that creates a ribbon of water and vegetation in the middle of one of the harshest environments in North America. The monument only gets about 5,000 visitors a year, mostly serious hikers and geology enthusiasts. There's one maintained trail, the Serpent's Descent, that switchbacks down the canyon wall, and a handful of backcountry routes that require permits and desert experience. My job, along with my partner Jamie Reeves, is to maintain that trail, monitor the fragile ecosystem at the canyon bottom, handle search and rescue when hikers inevitably get into trouble, and generally keep people from dying in creative ways in the desert. Jamie and I have been partners for 3 years. She came to Sonoran Deep from Yellowstone, burned out on managing crowds and enforcing regulations in a park that felt more like an amusement park than wilderness. She wanted isolation, wanted to work somewhere that still felt wild and dangerous and real. She's 41, ex-military, the kind of person who can hike 20 miles in heat that would kill most people and still have energy to joke around over dinner. We're not friends exactly. The job doesn't really allow for friendship when you're stuck together for weeks at a time. But we have the kind of partnership built on trust and competence. I'd trust her with my life, and I have, more than once. It was Jamie who first heard the sound. This was 3 weeks ago, mid-October, when the brutal summer heat had finally broken and the desert had become almost pleasant. We were doing a routine patrol of the Serpent's Descent, checking for rockfall and trail erosion after the monsoon season. The trail was in decent shape, a few places where we needed to reinforce the rock walls, some loose gravel to clear, and we'd made it about halfway down when Jamie stopped abruptly. "You hear that?" she asked, head cocked, listening. I stopped, hearing only the usual desert sounds. Wind moving through the canyon, the distant cry of a hawk, my own breathing. "Hear what?" Like singing or humming, really low, almost subsonic. She frowned, pressing her hand against the canyon wall. It's coming from inside the rock. I put my own hand on the wall. The stone was warm from the sun, rough with lichen, but I felt nothing unusual, no vibration, no sound. I don't hear anything. It just stopped. She pulled her hand back, looking puzzled. It was there for maybe 10 seconds. Definitely not wind, not animals. It sounded almost mechanical, but old, like those Tibetan singing bowls, that kind of resonance. We both stood there for another minute, listening, but whatever Jamie had heard didn't repeat. We continued our patrol, and I mostly forgot about it. Strange acoustics happen in canyons all the time. Wind and geology combining to create sounds that seem impossible. I'd once heard what sounded like a woman screaming in the desert at night, only to discover it was a mountain lion miles away. The sound carried and distorted by the terrain. But over the next week, Jamie heard it 5 more times, always when we were in the canyon, always seeming to come from the rock itself. And each time it lasted longer, 10 seconds, then 20, then nearly a minute. She tried recording it on her phone, but the audio captured only wind and our voices. Whatever frequency the sound existed at, it didn't register on digital recording devices. Maybe it's tinnitus, I suggested after the third occurrence, or some kind of pressure thing with your ears. She gave me a look that said she'd already considered and dismissed that possibility. I know what tinnitus sounds like, David. This is external, and it's not random. It only happens when we're below the rim, in the canyon proper, never at the ranger station, never on the surface. You think it's geological? Some kind of resonance from water moving through limestone? Maybe, but it sounds purposeful, like it's trying to form words or notes, but can't quite manage it. She pulled out a notebook where she'd been documenting each occurrence, and it's getting clearer. The first time I heard it, it was just a low hum. Now I can almost distinguish separate tones, like someone playing a chord on an instrument I don't recognize. I suggested she take a few days off, get checked out by a doctor, make sure there wasn't some kind of medical issue. She agreed reluctantly, hiked out to the ranger station, drove the 40 miles to the nearest clinic. They found nothing wrong. Hearing perfect, blood pressure normal, no signs of neurological problems. And while she was gone, I heard it too. I was doing a solo patrol, something we usually avoided but sometimes necessity demanded. I'd made it all the way to the canyon bottom, where the spring creates a small oasis of cottonwood trees and desert willows. The water was running clear, the vegetation lush by desert standards, everything peaceful and normal. I was kneeling by the water, filling my bottles, when the sound started. Jamie had described it perfectly, a low humming that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, vibrating through the air and stone simultaneously. It was almost subsonic, felt as much as heard, and it had that quality she'd mentioned, purposeful, structured, like language or music from a source I couldn't identify. I stood slowly, scanning the canyon walls. We were in a narrow section here, the walls rising sheer on both sides, no caves visible, no obvious source for the sound. But it was definitely there, growing louder, more complex. I could distinguish separate tones now, maybe 5 or 6 different frequencies woven together, rising and falling in patterns that suggested meaning, even though I couldn't decode it. My radio crackled. Unusual down here where the canyon walls blocked most signals. Jamie's voice came through, distorted but urgent. David, do you hear it? Tell me you hear it." "I hear it," I said, not taking my eyes off the canyon walls. "What is it?" "I don't know, but I'm coming down. Don't move. Don't go any further into the canyon. Just stay there." The sound continued for another 2 minutes, growing in complexity and volume until it was almost overwhelming, a physical presence in the air around me. Then it stopped, cut off abruptly like someone had closed the door, leaving a silence so complete it hurt. Jamie found me 20 minutes later sitting on a rock by the spring, trying to make sense of what I'd experienced. She looked relieved and frightened in equal measure. "So, I'm not crazy," she said. "If you're crazy, we both are." We sat there together, staring at the canyon walls, trying to find any rational explanation. Unusual rock formations that created resonance, seasonal underground rivers changing their flow patterns, some kind of military testing from the Air Force Base 50 miles away. None of it felt right. The sound hadn't been natural, and it hadn't been human-made. It had been something else entirely, something ancient and patient and utterly alien. "My grandfather used to tell stories," I said finally, "about the canyon, about things the old Hohokam people said lived down here before they disappeared. I always thought they were just stories, ways to keep kids from wandering too far." "What kind of things?" "He called them the echo people, said that they lived in the rock itself, in spaces between spaces, and that sometimes they'd sing to communicate with each other. He said the Hohokam understood them, had some kind of agreement or relationship, but when the Hohokam vanished around 1450, the echo people stayed behind, still singing, still waiting for someone to answer." Jamie looked at me like she was trying to decide if I was serious. "Your grandfather believed that?" "My grandfather spent 60 years working this canyon. He knew every inch of it. And he always said there were places you could hear them if you listened carefully, not with your ears, but with something deeper." I picked up a rock, turned it over in my hands. "He said the canyon chose our family because we could hear them, even if we didn't understand what they were saying." "That's folklore, David. Mythology." "Yeah, probably." I dropped the rock. "But we both just heard something that shouldn't exist. We reported the sound to our supervisor, described it as accurately as we could, suggested maybe we should get a geologist or acoustics expert to examine the canyon. He was skeptical, but agreed to file the report. Nothing came of it. Strange sounds in canyons weren't unusual enough to warrant an investigation, especially when they couldn't be recorded or consistently reproduced. But the sounds continued. Over the next 2 weeks, we heard them almost daily when we were in the canyon, always below the rim, always seeming to come from the rock itself. The tones grew more complex, more varied, and we both started to feel like they were responding to our presence. When we moved deeper into the canyon, the sounds grew louder. When we stayed still, they became almost conversational, as if something was trying to communicate in frequencies we could barely perceive. Jamie started mapping the sounds, noting where they occurred and when, trying to find patterns. She discovered that certain sections of the canyon seemed to be more active than others, particularly the north wall near the spring, where ancient petroglyphs marked the rock face. The Hohokam had carved symbols there centuries ago, spirals and human figures and geometric patterns that anthropologists said represented water, movement, and possibly religious significance. "Yeah, look at this one," Jamie said. pointing to a petroglyph of a human figure with lines radiating from its head. Every time we stand near this, the sounds get stronger, like it's a marker or an antenna or something. I studied the carving. It was weathered but still clear, and there was something about it that had always unsettled me. The figure's mouth was open wide, and the lines radiating from its head could be interpreted as sound waves or light, or maybe something emerging from the figure's mind. The old stories said the Echo people used certain rocks as doorways, I said quietly. Places where the boundary between their world and ours was thin. The Hohokam marked these places so people would know where to listen. Listen for what? I don't know. My grandfather never got that specific, or maybe he didn't know either. That night, we were sitting at the ranger station when Jamie pulled out her notebook, the one where she'd been documenting the sounds. She'd started sketching the patterns, rising and falling tones represented as waves, the various frequencies color-coded, the sequences numbered, page after page of visualized sound, trying to find meaning in the chaos. I think it's a language, she said, spreading the pages across the table. Not human language, not anything we'd recognize, but definitely structured communication. Look, these patterns repeat. Here, here, and here. Same sequence of tones in the same order. That's not random. That's intentional. I looked at her sketches, seeing the patterns she'd identified. She was right. There was structure there, repetition with variation, exactly what you'd expect from language. So, if it's communication, who's communicating? And with who? With us. With each other. I don't know. She ran her hands through her hair, frustrated. But I think they're trying to tell us something, and we're too deaf to understand it. Or maybe we're not supposed to understand it. Maybe we're just overhearing something not meant for human ears. She was quiet for a long moment, then said, I want to spend a night in the canyon. Bring recording equipment, seismographs, anything that might capture what we're hearing. Document it properly. That's against protocol. No one stays overnight in the backcountry without proper permits, and I know the rules, David. I'm saying maybe we need to break them. We're experiencing something significant here, something possibly unique, and we're the only ones who can document it because we're the only ones who can hear it. She looked at me intently. Your grandfather worked this canyon for 60 years. Did he ever mention anyone trying to actually communicate back? To answer the Echo people? I thought about it. My grandfather's stories had always been cautionary. Respect the canyon. Don't disturb what you don't understand. Listen, but don't respond. He said the Hohokam knew how to talk to them, but he never said anyone should try. Maybe that's exactly what we need to do. Maybe they're waiting for someone to answer. It took us 3 days to plan properly. We couldn't just disappear into the canyon without telling anyone. If something went wrong, if we got hurt or lost, we needed someone to know where we were, so we filed a backcountry permit under the guise of conducting an extended wildlife survey, packed enough gear for 2 nights, and hiked down the Serpent's Descent with equipment that had nothing to do with counting bighorn sheep. We set up camp at the spring in the shadow of the north wall where the petroglyphs marked the rock. Jamie arranged her equipment, a digital recorder, a seismograph borrowed from a geologist friend, a spectrum analyzer she'd bought online, and a simple acoustic microphone connected to her laptop. If the sounds occurred tonight, we'd capture them somehow, in some format, even if conventional recording devices had failed before. Sunset in the canyon was spectacular. the walls glowing red and gold as the light changed, shadows growing long and deep. We made dinner on a small camp stove, not talking much, both of us feeling the weight of what we were attempting. Around us, the desert settled into its nighttime rhythm, the chirp of crickets, the flutter of bats emerging to hunt, the distant yip of coyotes. The first sound came around midnight. I was half asleep in my tent when it started, that low, humming vibration that seemed to come from the earth itself. I scrambled out to find Jamie already at her equipment, adjusting levels, checking displays. The seismograph was showing activity, tiny vibrations consistent with sound waves traveling through rock. The spectrum analyzer was picking up frequencies at the very low end of human hearing, around 20 hertz, plus harmonics in higher ranges. "It's real," Jamie whispered, staring at her screens. "It's physically real. We're not hallucinating." The sound grew in complexity, multiple tones weaving together, and this time I could hear something I'd missed before: rhythm. Not a steady beat like music, but a pulsing pattern that reminded me of breathing or heartbeat, or the way waves hit a shore. Living rhythm, organic rhythm, coming from solid stone. Jamie was recording everything, her equipment capturing data that seemed impossible. The sound was too structured to be geological, too complex to be wind or water, too purposeful to be random acoustic phenomena. It was communication, just as she'd theorized, and we were finally documenting proof. Then Jamie did something I hadn't expected. She stood, walked to the canyon wall where the petroglyphs were carved, placed both hands on the rock, and began to hum. She was trying to harmonize with the sounds, matching the frequencies as closely as human vocal cords could manage. Her voice was low, resonant, creating overtones that seemed to blend with the sounds coming from the rock. And incredibly, impossibly, the sounds changed in response. The tones shifted, simplified, as if whatever was making them was adjusting its communication to match Jamie's more limited range. The complex weaving of frequencies reduced to something clearer, more distinct, and I could hear what she'd been trying to tell me for weeks. It did sound like language, alien language, structured in ways human speech wasn't, but definitely communication. Jamie continued humming, varying her tones, experimenting, and the sounds answered, creating a back-and-forth exchange that raised every hair on my body. She was talking to it, to them, to whatever lived in the rock and had been singing in this canyon for centuries or millennia or longer. I grabbed the spectrum analyzer, watching the frequencies interact. Jamie's voice creating patterns on the display, the rock sounds creating different patterns, the two woven together in something that looked almost like conversation. This was first contact, I realized with a shock that made my hands shake. Not with aliens from space, but with something that had been here all along, living in a space we couldn't perceive, communicating in frequencies we could barely hear. Jamie's humming grew more confident, her tones more varied and complex. She was learning the language in real time, adapting, trying to form something that approached meaning. And the sounds were encouraging her, repeating sequences, varying them slightly, teaching her the way you teach a child to speak. Then something changed. The sounds stopped being patient. They became urgent, insistent, the tones rising in pitch and volume. Jamie stepped back from the wall, her humming faltering, and I saw fear cross her face for the first time since this began. "Something's wrong," she said. "They're warning us about something." The urgency in the sounds increased, becoming almost painful, and now I could feel it through the ground beneath my feet. Vibrations that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. The seismograph was going crazy, showing tremors that shouldn't exist in stable rock, and the sounds had transformed from something almost musical to something harsh and discordant, like alarms or sirens or screams translated into impossible frequencies. "We need to leave," I said, starting to pack equipment. "Now." But Jamie wasn't listening. She was pressed against the canyon wall again, her hands splayed on the rock, her eyes closed, concentrating. "They're trying to tell us something important about the canyon, about why they're here, about what they're guarding." Guarding? There's something deeper, below the spring, below the canyon floor, something they've been keeping contained, keeping asleep, keeping separate from the surface, and it's waking up. The ground shook. A real earthquake this time, not just vibrations from sound. Rocks tumbled down the canyon wall, splashing into the spring. Our equipment toppled over, screens cracking, recording devices tumbling into the water, and the sounds from the rock were no longer trying to communicate. They were keening, a sound of distress or mourning or fear that needed no translation. "Jamie, we're leaving!" I grabbed her arm, pulling her away from the wall. She resisted for a moment, then allowed herself to be pulled back toward our camp. That's when the petroglyph moved. I don't mean it changed position. I mean the carved figure, the human with lines radiating from its head, rippled and shifted within the rock face as if the stone had become liquid. The open mouth grew wider, and from it emerged a sound that was not from the echo people, not from anything that belonged in this world. It was a roar and a whisper combined, a sound that existed in contradictions, loud and quiet, high and low, ancient and newborn. It bypassed my ears entirely and seemed to inject itself directly into my brain, filling my head with images that weren't mine. Vast spaces inside the earth, networks of caverns extending for miles, things that moved through rock like water, intelligences older than human civilization watching from the dark. And beneath it all, deeper than the deepest cave, something that had been dormant for thousands of years, finally stirring, waking, rising toward the surface. Jamie was screaming, not in fear, but in pain, her hands pressed to her ears, even though that wouldn't help against sound that bypassed physical hearing. I grabbed her, pulled her away from the wall, and we ran. We ran through our camp, abandoning everything, gear, food, equipment, everything except our bodies and our terror. We ran for the serpent's descent trail in darkness, using headlamps that seemed pathetically inadequate against the immensity of what was happening in the canyon below. Behind us, the sounds multiplied and changed. The echo people were still there, still singing, but now they were joined by other sounds. The grinding of stone on stone, the rush of water finding new channels, and that terrible roar whisper of something vast and awful forcing its way toward the surface. We made it halfway up the trail when the canyon floor collapsed. I looked back and saw the spring disappear into a suddenly opened chasm, the water draining away into darkness below. The cottonwood trees toppled into the void. The north wall, where the petroglyphs had been carved, cracked vertically, huge sections cavern away like glaciers, revealing hollows behind them, spaces in the rock where no spaces should be. And in those hollows, in the darkness behind the fallen stone, things were moving, I couldn't see them clearly. My eyes wouldn't focus properly, like trying to look at something in peripheral vision that vanishes when you turn your head. But I saw enough. Shapes that weren't human, that weren't animals, that weren't anything evolution should have produced. The echo people, forced out of their hidden spaces by whatever was rising from below. They poured out of the canyon walls like water, flowing upward and outward, escaping. And their sounds, their language, their warning, their song, filled the night air with harmonics so complex and beautiful and terrible that I knew I'd never hear ordinary music the same way again. We climbed. We climbed until our lungs burned and our legs gave out and we had to crawl. We climbed while the canyon tore itself apart below us, while the earth shook and the echo people fled, and something enormous moved in the darkness beneath the desert floor. We reached the rim as dawn was breaking, collapsed on solid ground, and watched the sun rise over a landscape that had changed. The canyon was wider now, deeper in places, shallower in others. The spring was gone completely, and the north wall, where generations of Hohokam had carved their warnings and their maps and their communication with the echo people, had collapsed into rubble. The sounds stopped. Everything stopped. The desert was silent in a way it had never been silent before. No birds, no insects, no wind, just absolute stillness, as if the entire ecosystem was holding its breath. Jamie was the first to speak, her voice hoarse. What did we do? I don't think we did anything. I think we just witnessed something that was already happening. I stood on shaking legs, looking at the changed canyon. The echo people were trying to warn us. They knew something was waking up, something they'd been guarding against, and they wanted us away from it. But what was it? What's down there? I thought about my grandfather's stories, about the Hohokam who'd disappeared suddenly in the 1450s, abandoning their settlements and irrigation systems and everything they'd built. What if they hadn't just left? What if they'd been warned by the echo people about something stirring in the earth, something that required them to evacuate an entire civilization? I think, I said slowly, that there are things in the earth older and stranger than we imagine, things that sleep for centuries or millennia. And I think the echo people, whatever they are, however they exist, have been standing watch over them, keeping them contained, keeping them separate from the surface world. And we disturbed that. No, I think it was waking up anyway. The echo people were trying to communicate that to us, trying to get us to leave before it fully emerged. I looked at her. The question is, did it fully emerge? Or did the echo people manage to push it back down? We didn't have an answer to that. We hiked back to the ranger station, reported a seismic event and canyon collapse, called for geological surveys and structural assessments. Teams came in over the next week, documenting the changes, trying to explain what had happened through conventional science. They found evidence of unusual underground water movement, shifts in the aquifer that could explain the collapse. They found unstable rock formations that had finally given way. They found perfectly rational geological explanations for everything we'd witnessed. They didn't find the echo people. They didn't find evidence of anything living in the rock. And when I tried to explain what we'd heard, what we'd experienced, they looked at me with the same expression the psychiatrist is using now. Concern mixed with skepticism, a gentle suggestion that trauma and isolation can play tricks on the mind. Maybe they're right. Maybe Jamie and I experienced some kind of shared hallucination, our brains creating explanations for natural phenomena we didn't understand. Maybe there's nothing in the earth but rock and water and minerals, no ancient guardians, no sleeping things, no consciousness in the stone. But I don't believe that, because 3 days ago, after they'd released us from observation, after the geological teams had packed up and left, after everything had returned to something approaching normal, I went back to the canyon alone. I hiked down what was left of the serpent's descent, picked my way through the rubble where the spring had been, and stood in the silence of the reformed canyon. And I listened, not with my ears, but with something deeper, the way my grandfather had taught me years ago when I was too young to understand what he meant. And I heard them, faint, distant, deep in the rock. The echo people were still there, still singing, but the song had changed. It was no longer trying to communicate with the surface, no longer teaching or warning or reaching out. It was focused inward, downward, concentrated on something beneath the canyon floor. They were still standing watch, still guarding, still holding something back. And every night since then, lying in my hospital bed while doctors try to convince me I imagined everything, I hear that song. It follows me, that low harmonic vibration that exists just at the edge of perception. Sometimes I think the echo people marked me somehow, made me a permanent listener, gave me the ability to hear them wherever I am. Or maybe they're warning me, because the song has an undercurrent now, a lower frequency that wasn't there before. And if I focus on it, if I really listen, I can hear what sounds like breathing, slow, patient breathing from something vast and deep and not quite asleep anymore. The echo people are singing louder than they have in centuries, their warning reverberating through rock and air and bone. And I'm one of the few people who can hear them, one of the few who knows what they're trying to say. It's waking up. Whatever sleeps beneath the Sonoran Desert, whatever the echo people have been guarding for longer than human memory, is rising toward the surface. And when it finally emerges, when it breaks through the last barriers of rock and earth and reality itself, the echo people's song will change one final time, from warning to morning, from vigil to requiem. I can hear it beginning already in the harmonics beneath the harmonics, in the frequencies that exist in spaces between spaces. The echo people know. They've always known. They've been standing watch for so long, keeping the boundary intact, holding back what should never be released. But boundaries weaken, guards grow tired, and some things are patient enough to wait out eternity. Jamie understands this too, though she won't admit it. She's being kept in a different facility, given different medications, asked different questions. But I know she hears the song just as I do. I know she lies awake at night, listening to the echo people's warning, understanding what it means. The canyon chose our family, my grandfather said, because we could hear them. Now I understand why that was never a gift. It was a burden. It was a responsibility. It was the price of knowledge, of knowing that there are things in the earth that predate us, that will outlast us, that exist in dimensions we can barely perceive. And knowing that when they move, when they wake, when they rise, all we can do is listen to the warnings of those who've been watching longer than humans have existed. The echo people are still singing, still warning, still standing watch in the deep places of the world. and I'm one of the few who can hear them getting tired. Story 2. I took the job at Redwood Marsh Wildlife Preserve because nobody else wanted it, and I needed the work badly enough not to ask why. After 3 years of bouncing between seasonal positions, ski patrol in winter, trail maintenance in summer, fire crew when things got desperate, I was exhausted by the constant moving, the temporary housing, the relationships that never lasted past a season. The preserve offered year-round employment, decent pay, and a small cabin on the property. The fact that it was located in a Louisiana bayou, miles from anything resembling civilization, seemed like a minor detail. The preserve manager, a weathered woman named Delphine Hebert, who looked about 70, but moved like 50, picked me up from the bus station in Thibodaux in a mud-splattered truck that smelled like diesel and Spanish moss. She didn't say much during the hour-long drive down increasingly narrow roads, just handed me a thermos of chicory coffee and pointed out landmarks, a bait shop that served as the last place to buy supplies, a boat launch where locals fished for catfish, a church with a cemetery that seemed to have more graves than the surrounding area could possibly need. "You from around here?" she finally asked as we turned onto a dirt road that disappeared into a tunnel of cypress and tupelo trees. "California originally. Been working all over the West for the last few years." She nodded like this confirmed something. "West is different. Drier. Mountains and valleys, everything visible. This place is different. The marsh doesn't follow the same rules. You'll see." "What kind of rules?" "The kind that matter when you're alone out there." She glanced at me, her eyes sharp despite the crow's feet. "You running from something or towards something?" The question caught me off guard. "Neither. Just working." Everybody's running from or toward. Nobody just works. She turned her attention back to the road, which had narrowed to barely more than tire ruts through standing water. Last ranger we had she was running from lasted 8 months before she left in the middle of the night. Didn't even collect her last paycheck. What was she running from? Boyfriend, who put her in the hospital twice. She needed somewhere he couldn't find her. Marsh is good for that. Very good at hiding things. Delphine's voice had taken on an odd tone, something between reassurance and warning. Problem was, she started to feel like the marsh was hiding her too well. Started to feel like maybe she couldn't find her way back if she wanted to. Before I could ask what that meant, we emerged into a clearing where a cluster of buildings sat on slightly higher ground. A small visitor center that looked rarely visited, a maintenance shed, and a cabin that would be my home. Beyond them, a wooden boardwalk extended into the swamp like a tongue reaching into green darkness. "That's the main interpretive trail," Delphine said, pointing at the boardwalk. 2 miles out, loops back around. We've got 3 other trails, all marked with colored blazes. Red Trail is 3 miles, follows the western edge of the preserve. Blue Trail is 4 miles, goes deeper into the interior. Yellow Trail is the longest at 6 miles, circles the whole property. Your job is to patrol them twice a week, maintain the boardwalks, clear any deadfall, watch for poachers, document wildlife, standard ranger stuff. She handed me a map that showed the preserve as a rough triangle of wetland bordered by narrow waterways. The trails were marked in their respective colors, elegant loops that seemed to explore every part of the property without crossing each other. We get about 50 visitors a month, mostly during winter when the mosquitoes die back. You'll be alone most of the time. Radio works if you stay near the buildings. but it's spotty once you get deep in the trails. Cell phones are useless out here." She looked at me seriously. "The most important thing is to stay on the marked trails. I mean that. Don't go off trail, don't explore, don't take shortcuts. The marsh will let you wander, but it won't always let you back." "Is it dangerous? Sinkholes? Quicksand?" "Among other things." She didn't elaborate. Instead, she helped me unload my gear and showed me around the cabin. One room with a kitchenette, a bathroom with a rust-stained sink, a bed that sagged in the middle, and windows covered in screens to keep out the insects. It smelled like mildew and old wood, but it was mine, at least for now. Delphine left before dark, promising to return in 2 weeks with supplies. "Radio check every morning at 8, she said. "You miss 2 checks in a row, I'll come looking. And remember, stay on the trails. The colored blazes are there for a reason." That first night, I lay in bed listening to the swamp come alive. Frogs sang in chorus so loud it sounded like machinery. Something large splashed in the water nearby. An owl called and was answered by another, farther away, and underneath all of it, a constant susurrus of movement, water sliding past cypress knees, wind moving through Spanish moss, the wet sounds of things living and dying in the dark. I thought about what I was running from or toward, as Delphine had phrased it. The truth was messier than either direction. I was running from my own mediocrity, from the realization at 32 that I'd spent a decade moving without arriving anywhere. No real relationships because I never stayed long enough. No real career because I took whatever job was available. No real home because everywhere felt temporary. I'd convinced myself I was adventurous, flexible, free, but lately it felt more like I was lost and had been for years without noticing. The marsh, at least, seemed like a place where being lost was expected. I started my patrols 3 days later, once I'd familiarized myself with the equipment and paperwork. I chose the main interpretive trail first, the easiest introduction to the preserve. The boardwalk was well maintained, sturdy cypress planks forming a path through a landscape that seemed to exist in constant transition between land and water. Bald cypress trees rose from the dark water like sentinels, their trunks wide at the base and draped with moss that moved in the slight breeze. The water itself was the color of tea, stained by tannins from decaying vegetation, and so still in places, it reflected the canopy with perfect clarity. Wildlife was everywhere once I learned to see it. Alligators sunning on logs, turtles stacked on fallen branches, herons stalking through the shallows with prehistoric patience. I saw a cottonmouth coiled on the boardwalk railing and gave it wide berth. The humidity was oppressive, even in late September, and within an hour I was soaked with sweat. The trail markers were exactly as described, small colored blazes painted on trees at regular intervals. Yellow diamonds for the yellow trail, blue circles for the blue trail, red squares for the red trail, and white rectangles for the main interpretive loop. Impossible to miss if you paid attention. Except at the 2-mile mark where the main trail should have circled back toward the visitor center, I found another marker, a green triangle painted on a cypress tree about 20 feet off the boardwalk, where the ground looked almost solid beneath a carpet of duckweed. I stopped, checking my map. There was no green trail marked, no mention of a 5th trail system, but the blaze was clearly fresh paint, the same style as all the others, and now that I'd noticed it, I could see more green triangles leading deeper into the swamp, spaced at the same intervals as the other trail markers. I should have radioed Delphine immediately, should have asked about the unmarked trail, but something about the discovery excited me. A mystery, a puzzle, something unexpected in what had seemed like a straightforward job. I took a photo of the green blaze with my camera, made a note in my logbook, and continued back to the cabin. That night, I studied the map more carefully, trying to figure out where a green trail might lead. The preserve boundaries were clearly marked, and the existing trails covered most of the accessible area. Any additional trail would either be redundant or would lead to one of the preserve's edges, possibly toward the private property that bordered the eastern side. Over the next week, I found more green blazes. They appeared on every trail I patrolled, always leading away from the marked paths, always deeper into the swamp's interior. I documented each one, photographing the markers and noting their locations. The blazes formed a pattern. They seemed to spiral inward toward a central point somewhere in the preserve's heart, an area my map showed as particularly dense wetland, probably impassable. "You seen any unusual trail markers?" I asked Delphine during our 2-week supply run. I'd decided to play it casual, not wanting to admit I'd been obsessing over the green blazes. She paused while unloading boxes of canned goods from her truck. "What kind of unusual?" "Green triangles, leading off the main trails." Her expression didn't change, but I noticed her hands stopped moving. "And you followed them?" "No, I just noticed them, documented them. They're not on the map." "That's because they're not trails." She resumed unloading, her movements more deliberate now. "They are old markers from when we were first surveying the property, deciding which areas could support boardwalks. Most of them should have been removed or painted over years ago. They look fresh. Paint lasts longer than you'd think in this humidity. Moisture seals it somehow." She wouldn't meet my eyes. "Ignore them. They don't lead anywhere useful." But she was lying. I could tell by the way she changed the subject immediately, asking about my wildlife logs, commenting on the weather, talking about everything except the green blazes. And if she was lying, it meant the green trail did lead somewhere, and she didn't want me to find it. That night, alone in the cabin, with rain hammering on the tin roof, I made a decision. I would follow the green blazes. Not far, just far enough to see where they led, to satisfy my curiosity. I'd be careful, bring my radio and GPS, mark my own path if I needed to. I'd been working in wilderness areas for years. I knew how to navigate, how to stay safe. I chose the blue trail as my starting point because it took me deepest into the preserve before the green blazes branched off. I set out early, the morning air thick with fog that turned the cypress trees into ghosts. Egrets called from somewhere in the mist. My boots echoed on the boardwalk planks, each step announcing my presence to whatever was listening. At the 2-mile mark on the blue trail where the boardwalk curved around a particularly large cypress, I found the green blaze. It pointed toward a natural levee that rose slightly above the waterline, covered in palmetto and wild iris. I'd brought a hiking staff to test the ground ahead of me, and I used it now, probing carefully before each step. The ground was soft but navigable, at least initially. The green blazes continued at regular intervals, leading me through a landscape that grew increasingly strange. The trees here were older, larger, their trunks twisted into shapes that seemed almost intentional. The Spanish moss hung so thick it created curtains, and I had to push through it like cobwebs. The water, when I glimpsed it between the vegetation, was darker here, nearly black, and completely still. I'd been following the green trail for maybe 20 minutes when I noticed the sound had changed. The normal swamp symphony, frogs, birds, insects, had diminished to almost nothing. Not silent, but muted, as if someone had turned down the volume on the entire ecosystem. My radio crackled with static, though I hadn't tried to transmit anything. The green blazes led me to a clearing of sorts, an area where the trees formed a rough circle around a space of clear water, maybe 30 feet across. The water here was different, clearer than the tea-colored swamp water with a faint greenish tint, and I could see down into it surprisingly far. There appeared to be structures below the surface, wooden posts, maybe the remains of an old platform or building covered in algae and trailing vegetation. But what stopped me cold was the boat. It was a small aluminum john boat, the kind locals use for fishing, tied to a cypress knee at the water's edge. The boat was old but not ancient, maybe 15 or 20 years, and it looked maintained. No holes in the hull, the rope still strong, a paddle lying inside, as if someone had recently used it and planned to return. I approached carefully, checking the ground with each step. The boat had a registration number stamped on the bow, partially obscured by mud. I pulled out my camera to photograph it, and that's when I saw the contents. A backpack, a water bottle, a ranger jacket folded neatly on the seat. With hands that had started to shake, I unfolded the jacket. It was a standard Park Service uniform jacket, green with the official patch. Inside the collar was a name tag, S. Garrett, the ranger who'd left in the middle of the night 8 months ago. My radio erupted with noise, not static, but voices. Multiple voices speaking over each other, fragments of words and sentences that made no sense. Following the green. Water is clearer here. How long have I? Can't find the way back. The blazes keep changing. Not alone in the... I turned the radio off with numb fingers. The clearing was absolutely silent now. Even the ambient swamp sounds completely gone. The water in the pond was so still it looked like glass, reflecting the canopy above with perfect clarity. That's when I noticed the reflection was wrong. In the water, the trees formed the same circle, but there were structures visible that didn't exist in reality. A boardwalk extending across the pond, signs marking a trail, and figures, human-shaped shadows standing at the water's edge where I stood alone. I looked up, checking the actual clearing. No boardwalk, no signs, no other people. I looked down at the reflection. The boardwalk was clearer now, and I could read one of the signs. Green Trail 3 miles to Visitor Center. But there was no visitor center in this direction. There was no green trail. There was only the wild interior of the preserve, the area my map showed as impassable. Unless the map was wrong, unless there had been another trail system, another set of facilities, something that had been here before and was somehow still here, visible in reflections, but not in reality. I backed away from the water, my breath coming fast. The green blazes that had led me here continued past the clearing, leading deeper into the swamp. And now that I looked more carefully, I could see other things. Pieces of boardwalk planking partially submerged in the mud, metal signs so corroded they were barely recognizable, the remains of what might have been a bench or observation platform. This had been a trail once, an official trail with boardwalks and signs and rangers who maintained it. But something had happened to it, something that made Delphine lie about the green blazes, that made the previous ranger leave in the middle of the night, that made this place exist in reflections and memories, but not quite in reality. I pulled out my GPS unit, checking my coordinates. The device flickered, the screen showing my location shifting impossibly. First placing me at the visitor center, then miles outside the preserve boundary, then underwater, then coordinates that didn't exist on Earth. I turned it off and relied on my compass, taking a bearing back the way I'd come. But when I looked for my trail, the path I'd marked in my memory, the disturbed vegetation that should have shown my passage, I couldn't find it. The palmetto looked uniformly undisturbed. The ground showed no footprints, even though I'd been walking through mud minutes before. I tried to follow the green blazes backward, but they seemed different now. The triangles pointed in different directions than I remembered, or maybe there were simply more of them, creating multiple possible paths. I chose the most obvious route and walked for 15 minutes before realizing I was moving in a spiral, seeing the same twisted cypress from different angles, passing the same fallen log 3 times. Hey, the sound was returning, but it was wrong. Frogs, yes, but their chorus was too regular, too rhythmic, like a recording playing on loop. Birds calling, but the same call repeated at exact intervals. And underneath it all, a sound that might have been water moving, or might have been breathing, a slow, wet respiration that seemed to come from the swamp itself. My radio crackled back to life even though I hadn't turned it on. Delphine's voice came through, distorted and strange. Told you to stay on the marked trails. The marsh lets you wander, won't always let you back. Delphine, this is Marcus. I'm on the green trail. I need directions back to... There is no green trail, her voice said, but the timing was wrong, the words overlapping with my transmission. There hasn't been a green trail for 30 years, not since the accident, not since we lost the old visitor center and everything around it. It sank, Marcus. The whole section of the preserve just sank. Took the boardwalks and the buildings and the rangers who were there when it happened. We rebuilt on higher ground, painted over the old blazes, tried to forget. But the markers are fresh. The boat is. The marsh gives things back sometimes, pieces of what it took, reflections of what was. But they're not real, Marcus. They're memories. And if you follow them too far, if you go too deep, you become a memory too. The transmission cut off. I was standing at the edge of the circular clearing again, though I'd been walking away from it. The boat was still there, but now there were 2 backpacks visible inside it, 2 ranger jackets, 2 water bottles. One of the name tags read S. Garrett. The other read M. Webb. My name. I ran. I ran without caring about direction, without trying to navigate, just moving away from that clearing and whatever it represented. Palmetto lashed at my legs. Spanish moss caught at my face. My boots sank into mud that grabbed at each step. But I kept moving, driven by a terror that was too large for rational thought. I burst through a curtain of moss and found myself on a boardwalk. Relief flooded through me. I'd found one of the marked trails. I was safe. But when I looked at the blazes on the nearest tree, they were green. Green triangles leading in both directions, suggesting this boardwalk was part of the ghost trail, the memory trail, the trail that didn't exist. except I was standing on it. The wood was solid under my feet, real, physical. I chose a direction at random and followed the boardwalk, passing green blaze after green blaze. The swamp around me looked normal, cypress trees, dark water, the usual wildlife. But there was a quality to it all that felt like a photograph, slightly too perfect, slightly too still. The boardwalk led to a structure, a visitor center larger than the one at my cabin, built in a style that looked 30 years out of date. The windows were dark, but intact. A sign hung above the door, Redwood Marsh Wildlife Preserve Welcome Center. I climbed the steps. The wood was solid, recently maintained, and tried the door. It opened. Inside, the visitor center was frozen in time. Displays about marsh ecology, their information panels yellowed with age, a desk with a computer so old it had a CRT monitor, maps on the walls showing a trail system different from the one I knew, 4 colored trails instead of 3, and prominently marked in green. Green Trail 5 miles experienced hikers only. There were photos on the walls too. Rangers from past decades, their faces smiling at the camera, their uniforms slightly different from modern ones. I recognized Delphine in one photo, looking about 40 years old, standing with 2 other rangers in front of this very building. The caption read, Redwood Marsh Staff, 1993. And in another photo, more recent, from maybe 10 years ago, S. Garrett Ranger of the Month, January 2014. Sarah Garrett, the ranger who'd left in the middle of the night. Except in this photo, she looked happy, relaxed, at home in the marsh. There was a logbook on the desk, the kind rangers used before everything went digital. I flipped it open, expecting old entries, but the last entry was dated yesterday. October 15th, 2024. Daily patrol of Green Trail completed. No incidents, weather clear. Observed usual wildlife. Visitor count, 0. Note, found evidence of another ranger on the trail today. Footprints, broken palmettos, signs of passage. We'll investigate tomorrow. May finally have company out here. It gets lonely maintaining this place alone. S. Garrett. My hands were shaking again. Today was October 16th, 2024. If Sarah Garrett had written this yesterday, she was still here, still maintaining a visitor center that didn't exist, patrolling a trail that had been closed for 30 years, working a job in a place the marsh had swallowed. You shouldn't have followed the green blazes, a voice said behind me. I spun around. A woman stood in the doorway, late 30s, dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, wearing a ranger uniform. Sarah Garrett, looking exactly like her photos, looking solid and real and alive. I didn't know, I managed to say. I didn't know what they were. No one ever does. That's how it works. The marsh shows you something that doesn't quite fit, something that makes you curious. And you follow it because that's what we do. We're rangers. We explore, we document, we try to understand. She stepped into the building, and I noticed she cast no shadow despite the light coming through the windows. I followed them 8 months ago, or maybe it was 8 years. Time works differently here. Delphine said you left. She said, I tried to leave. Got all the way to the parking area, packed my truck, started driving. Made it about 5 miles before I realized I was on a road that didn't exist, heading toward a highway that had never been built. The marsh had already taken me by then. I just didn't know it yet. She looked around the visitor center with something like affection. So I came back. Easier to accept it than keep trying to leave. But you're real. You're standing here. This building is real. Real enough. For here. She gestured at the displays, the desk, the maps. This is what the preserve was before the sinkhole event, before the ground shifted and everything here collapsed into the aquifer below. 15 people died, rangers, visitors, a school group on a field trip. One day, there was a fully functioning preserve with trails and facilities, and the next day, there was just water and mud and twisted metal. They recovered most of the bodies, but not all, and they couldn't recover the place itself, the space where people had worked and learned and existed, so the marsh kept it, preserved it, the way a preserve should. I backed toward the door, but she shook her head. You can leave. You're not like me yet. You followed the blazes, but you didn't work here before, didn't die here when it sank. You can still find your way back to the real trails, the ones that exist in the present. But you have to want to leave more than you want to understand. That's the trick. Most rangers are curious. We want to know, and the wanting keeps us here. How do I get back? She pulled a map from the desk. Not the modern map I carried, but an older one, hand-drawn, showing the ghost trail system. Follow the green blazes backward, not the way you came, but the way you should have come. Trust the reflection, not the reality. When you reach water, look down instead of forward. Follow your reflection until it leads you somewhere solid. That doesn't make sense. Nothing about this makes sense, but it works. It's how the marsh operates, through paradox and memory and paths that exist because someone remembers them existing. She handed me the map, and her hand felt cold and slightly damp, like she'd been underwater. Go now, before you see too much, before you understand too well, before you start thinking that maybe being a memory isn't so different from being real. I took the map and ran, bursting out of the visitor center into a landscape that flickered between present and past. Sometimes I saw the ghost boardwalks and signs. Sometimes I saw only wild swamp. I followed the map Sarah had given me, trusting its impossible directions, looking for water that could show me my reflection. I found it at a place where the green trail crossed a channel of clear water. Looking down, I saw myself standing on a boardwalk that led in a different direction than the one I was on. I stepped onto the reflection, stepped onto water that held me like solid ground, and followed my own image through the marsh. The landscape shifted with each step, becoming more familiar, more present. The green blazes began to fade, replaced by blue circles that I recognized as the blue trail markers. The ghost structures vanished. The sound of the swamp normalized, less rhythmic, less artificial, more chaotically alive. And suddenly I was standing on the real blue trail boardwalk 3 miles from the visitor center with no memory of the transition between there and here. My boots were muddy, my clothes were torn, but I was back. I radioed Delphine the moment I had signal. I found it, the old preserve, the green trail. Long silence, then, "Did you see her, Sarah?" "Yes." Was she? "She's maintaining the memory, keeping it running. She said I could leave because I didn't die there." Another long silence. "Come back to the cabin, Marcus. We need to talk." Delphine was waiting when I arrived, sitting on the cabin's porch with 2 bottles of beer already opened. She handed me one without a word, and we sat in silence while the sun set and the swamp came alive with evening sounds. "I was there when it happened," she finally said. 31 years ago. I was doing a morning patrol, checking on a school group that was supposed to arrive for a tour. I heard the sound like the whole world sighing, and the ground just dropped. The entire eastern section of the preserve collapsed into a sinkhole 60 feet deep. Boardwalks, buildings, people, all gone in about 30 seconds. Sarah said 15 people died. 14. We recovered 14 bodies. The 15th was never found. A college student who'd been volunteering for the summer. We searched for weeks. She took a long drink from her beer. The thing is, I kept seeing her on patrols, in the distance, always at the edge of my vision, and sometimes I'd find her footprints in the mud, fresh ones, leading deeper into the preserve. I followed them once, found the green blazes, found the ghost trail, but I turned back. I wasn't curious enough or brave enough, or maybe just not broken enough to follow all the way. The marsh took the place but kept it somehow. Places have memory, same as people. Traumatic events leave marks. The preserve remembers what it was, and the marsh holds on to that memory because that's what wetlands do. They preserve things, slow down decay, keep the past mixed up with the present. She looked at me directly. Sarah wasn't the first ranger to follow those blazes. She's just the first one who decided to stay, or maybe couldn't figure out how to leave. The marsh is patient. It'll take anyone curious enough to explore what shouldn't be explored. Why didn't you warn me more explicitly? Because we need rangers, and nobody would take this job if they knew the truth, and because warning people not to do something just makes them more likely to do it. I hoped you'd be too busy with real work to notice the ghost trail. Most rangers are. She finished her beer and stood. You can leave if you want, transfer out. I'll approve it. No questions asked. And if I stay, then you stay on the marked trails, the real ones, and you don't go looking for what the marsh has hidden. She paused at the steps. But you'll see them sometimes. The green blazes appearing where they shouldn't be. The marsh will keep offering, keep tempting, and you'll have to decide every time whether you're curious enough to follow. She left, and I sat on the porch in the gathering darkness, thinking about choice and curiosity, and the fine line between exploring and being lost. I stayed. I told myself it was because I needed the job, needed the stability, needed a place to stop running. But the truth was more complicated. Sarah had said you had to want to leave more than you wanted to understand, and I wasn't sure I did. Part of me wanted to see the ghost trail again, wanted to map its impossible geography, wanted to understand how a place could exist in memory and reflection. I've been at Redwood Marsh for 8 months now. I patrol the marked trails, maintain the boardwalks, document wildlife. I do my job well, but I see the green blazes regularly appearing overnight on trees I checked the day before, marking paths that seem to shift location, always leading toward that collapsed section of the preserve where the past hasn't quite finished happening. I haven't followed them again, not yet. But I keep Sarah's hand-drawn map in my desk drawer, and sometimes late at night I study it, tracing the routes of the ghost trail, wondering what else might be preserved there in that pocket of memory, wondering if the 15 people who died are all still there somehow, maintaining a preserve that exists only in reflection, doing jobs that ended 30 years ago, trapped or choosing to stay, or unable to tell the difference. Wondering if one day I'll be curious enough or broken enough or simply tired enough of running to follow those green blazes all the way to wherever they truly lead. The marsh is patient. It preserves things. And I'm starting to think it's preserving a place for me, too, keeping a space open in its memory, waiting for the day when I want to understand more than I want to leave. The green blazes appeared on my cabin's porch this morning, 3 of them, painted on the floorboards while I slept, leading toward the door, pointing toward the trails, inviting me deeper. I should paint over them. I should request that transfer. But instead, I'm writing this account, documenting what I found, leaving a record for whoever comes after me, because I think I finally understand what I'm running toward. And it's not away from anything. It's toward a place where being lost is the same as being found, where memory and reality merge, where the past is preserved perfectly in dark water, and the present is just another reflection waiting to sink. The green blazes are still there, fresh and bright and impossible. And tomorrow, I think I'll follow them. Just a little farther this time, just far enough to understand. Story 3. I became a fire lookout because I wanted to disappear for a while, and there's no better place to vanish than a metal box perched on top of a mountain with nothing but sky in every direction. After my brother died, after I watched pancreatic cancer hollow him out over 8 months until there was nothing left but pain and morphine dreams, I needed distance from everything that reminded me of him. Which was everything. Our apartment in Portland, the coffee shop where we'd meet every Sunday, the hiking trails we'd explored together. Even my own reflection started to look too much like his in those final weeks, and I couldn't stand it. The Forest Service didn't ask too many questions when I applied for the summer lookout position at Tower 9 in the Cascade Range. They needed warm bodies willing to spend 3 months alone on a mountaintop watching for smoke, and I needed to be somewhere my phone didn't work and nobody knew my story. It seemed like a fair trade. I arrived at the trailhead on June 1st with 60 pounds of gear and a packet of instructions that made the job sound simple. Scan the horizon every 15 minutes during daylight hours, report any smoke via radio, maintain the equipment, keep the logbook updated, don't die. The hike up was brutal, 7 miles of switchbacks gaining 3,000 feet. But when I finally emerged above the tree line and saw Tower 9 perched on the summit like a glass and metal bird's nest, something in my chest loosened for the first time in months. The tower was a 14 by 14 foot room wrapped in windows on all sides, elevated 40 feet off the ground on metal stilts. Inside was a bed, a small stove, a desk with the firefinder equipment, shelves for supplies, and a 2-way radio that was my only connection to the world below. The previous lookout had left the place immaculate, everything labeled and organized, firewood stacked neatly, the windows spotless. There was a note taped to the desk in cramped handwriting. Good luck. The solitude gets easier after the first week. Don't forget to look down sometimes, not just out. KP. I didn't understand what that meant. Looking down from the tower just showed you the foundation, the rocky slope, the tops of trees far below. But I taped the note to the wall anyway, a small gesture of connection to another person who'd lived this strange, isolated life. The first 2 weeks were exactly what I needed. I fell into a rhythm. Wake at dawn, make coffee on the propane stove, begin the watch rotations, heat up canned soup for lunch, continue scanning, read during the quiet hours, scan again, watch the sunset paint the mountains in colors that seemed impossible, sleep hard and dreamless. The radio stayed mostly quiet except for morning and evening check-ins with dispatch. No fires, no emergencies. Just me and the mountains and the kind of silence that feels alive. I thought about my brother less, or maybe I thought about him differently. Up here, the grief felt cleaner somehow, less tangled up with guilt and anger and the horrible helplessness of watching someone die by degrees. I could remember the good things, his laugh, the way he'd argue passionately about the most ridiculous topics, his inexplicable talent for finding four-leaf clovers without immediately drowning in the loss. It was on day 16 that I found the first photograph. I'd been reorganizing the supply shelf, taking inventory of canned goods and batteries, when I knocked over a box of old equipment manuals, papers scattered across the floor. And as I gathered them up, a Polaroid fluttered out from between two pages. I picked it up, expecting maybe a landscape shot or a photo of a previous lookout's family. Instead, I found myself looking at a picture of Tower 9's interior, taken from the doorway. The photo was dated in the white border, June 3rd, 1987. Everything in the shot looked similar to how it looked now. Same layout, same basic furniture, but there was a person visible in the image, sitting at the desk with their back to the camera. They wore a green Ranger jacket, and their posture suggested they were writing in the logbook. But something about the photo made my skin prickle. The figure was slightly blurred, as if they'd moved during the exposure, and the angle seemed wrong somehow, like the camera had been held at chest height rather than eye level. What really unsettled me was that I could see another photograph lying on the desk in front of the person in the image, a photograph within the photograph. I held the Polaroid up to the light, squinting, trying to make out any detail of that nested image, but it was too small and indistinct. I checked the logbook, flipping back through years of entries until I found June 1987. The handwriting was different from the recent entries, looping and elaborate. Most entries were routine smoke reports and weather observations. But on June 3rd, there was a longer note. Found a photograph in the manual box today. Can't explain it. The photo shows the tower exactly as it is now, but it's dated 1987, which is today. That's impossible. More concerning is what I can see in the photo within the photo. I think I need to look more carefully at everything KP left behind. Something isn't right about the way he disappeared. My hands went cold. I flipped forward a few pages. June 5th. Dispatch confirmed KP, Kenneth Patterson, was never found after he failed to report in last August. They assumed he'd hiked down without notifying anyone and quit. But his gear was all here, his vehicle at the trailhead, radio working fine. He just stopped transmitting mid-season. No one looked very hard because there's a high turnover rate for this position. People quit. They said I shouldn't worry about it. June 8th. The photographs are multiplying. I found another one today tucked inside the first aid kit. Same type, a Polaroid of the tower interior with someone at the desk. This one is dated June 8th, 1987, today. And in this photo, the person at the desk is holding a Polaroid. I can just barely see it in the image. It looks like a picture of someone holding a picture of someone holding a picture, regressing infinitely inward. I tried to take my own photograph to test something, but my camera isn't working. The flash fires, but no image appears on the film. I've gone through an entire pack. The entries continued for another week, growing increasingly disturbed and erratic. The writer, who never signed their name, described finding more photographs, each one dated the current day, each one showing the tower and a figure at the desk holding another photograph. They also mentioned hearing sounds at night. Footsteps on the stairs despite being alone, scratching on the windows, and most disturbingly, their own voice on the radio during the dead hours after midnight, transmitting messages they didn't remember sending. The final entry, dated June 16, 1987. I understand now. The photographs aren't appearing in the tower. They've always been here, every single one. I found them all today, hidden in different locations. In the mattress, inside the stovepipe, behind the firefinder's casing, even inside the radio. Dozens of them. And they're all the same image with different dates stretching back to 1952 when the tower was built. We're all in these photographs. Every lookout who's ever been stationed here. KP is in one from last August. I'm in one from yesterday. And in each photo, the person at the desk is holding a photograph of another person holding a photograph of another person. All the way down to something I can't quite see at the center of it all. Something dark and small and waiting. I'm going to hike down tomorrow. I don't care if it means breaking contract, but I have to leave the photographs here. I tried to burn one and it wouldn't catch. Tried to tear one and the paper wouldn't rip. They want to stay in the tower. Maybe they need to stay in the tower. If you're reading this and you're the next lookout, I'm sorry. I'm sorry I couldn't warn you properly. And whatever you do, don't take a photograph of yourself. Don't try to add to the collection. It's waiting for you to complete something. I can feel it waiting. The entry ended there. I flipped through the rest of the logbook, but there was nothing more until May of the following year, when a new lookout had started documenting routine observations in a different handwriting, making no mention of any photographs or previous warnings. I sat at the desk, the Polaroid still in my hand, and felt the tower differently around me. The windows that had seemed so open and freeing now felt like eyes, watching in every direction. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was expectant. Yeah. I should have radioed dispatch right then, should have told them I was hiking down, emergency or not. But the sun was already setting, and descending that trail in darkness was genuinely dangerous. I told myself I'd stay one more night and leave at first light. A reasonable decision, a practical decision. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of metal in the wind sounded like footsteps. Every shadow cast by my lantern looked like a person standing just outside the window. And around 2 in the morning, my radio crackled alive. Tower 9, this is Tower 9, do you copy? My own voice, coming through the radio, exactly like my voice, but with an odd flatness to it, like someone reading from a script without quite understanding the words. I stared at the radio, not touching it. The transmission continued. Tower 9, confirming position. I'm at the desk. I'm writing in the logbook. I found the photographs today. I understand now. Tower 9, do you copy? I grabbed the radio and switched it off. Then I unplugged it from the battery for good measure. My hands were shaking. In the silence that followed, I heard something else. The soft mechanical whir of a camera, a Polaroid camera, developing a picture. It came from inside the tower, from behind me. I spun around but saw nothing, just my supplies, my gear, the neat organization of a space I've been living in for over 2 weeks. The sound didn't repeat, but when I turned back to the desk, There was a new Polaroid lying on the logbook, still developing, the image gradually emerging from the chemical fog. I watched my own face appear in the photograph. I was sitting at the desk, right now, in this moment, staring forward at the camera with an expression I didn't remember making. Something blank and hollow. And in the photograph, I was holding another photograph, though I could only see the edge of it in the frame. The date on the border read June 16, 2024. Today. I didn't remember anyone taking this picture. I was alone in the tower. The door was locked from the inside. That's when I started searching in earnest, tearing through the tower's storage areas, looking for the collection the previous lookout had described. I found them exactly where they'd said, hidden in impossible places, tucked into gaps that shouldn't exist, folded into spaces too small to contain them. Dozens of Polaroids, maybe over 100, each one showing the interior of Tower 9 with a person at the desk. The dates ranged from 1952 to yesterday. Different people in different clothes from different eras, but always the same composition. Taken from the doorway, showing someone at the desk, each person holding a smaller photograph. I laid them out on the floor in chronological order, and a pattern emerged. Every single lookout who'd ever been stationed at Tower 9 was represented, sometimes with multiple photographs across their tenure, and in every image, if you looked closely at the photograph within the photograph, you could see another person holding another photograph, and within that, another person, and another, receding like reflections in parallel mirrors, until the images became too small to distinguish. Except in the earliest photograph, the one from July 1952, I could see something at the center of all those nested images. At the very end of the regression, where the photographs collapsed into an infinitesimal point, there was something dark. Not a person, not anything with a recognizable shape, just a small darkness that seemed to move if you stared at it too long, like oil on water. I grabbed a magnifying glass from the equipment drawer and examined that central darkness more closely. The more I looked, the more it seemed to have depth, as if the photograph contained actual space, rather than just an image of space, and in that depth, something was looking back. Dawn came eventually, the way it always does, indifferent to human terror. As soon as there was enough light to navigate the trail safely, I started packing. I'd leave everything behind except water and the basics. I'd break contract, pay whatever penalty they demanded, but I'd get off this mountain and never come back. I was rolling up my sleeping bag when I noticed the logbook lying open on the desk. I hadn't touched it since finding the last entry from 1987, but now it was open to today's page, and there was new writing there, in handwriting that looked disturbingly like mine, but wasn't quite right. The letters were the correct shape, but the pressure and spacing were slightly off, like a forgery done by someone who'd studied my writing carefully, but couldn't quite replicate the unconscious elements of it. June 16th, 2024. I found the photographs today. I understand now. It's not a haunting. It's a documentation. The tower is recording us, or something is recording us through the tower. Every lookout who's ever been alone up here, every moment of solitude and isolation. It's collecting us, storing us in the photographs, filing us away in these nested images that collapse toward that central darkness. That thing that was here before the tower, before the mountain had a name, before there were people to be alone. It feeds on isolation, on the specific despair of being separate from the world. And we keep coming up here, year after year, offering ourselves to it. The photographs aren't appearing, they're being taken. Every time we're truly alone, not just physically, but emotionally, when the isolation settles into our bones and we forget what it's like to be part of something larger than ourselves. It takes another picture, another moment, another piece. I'm leaving now. I have to leave. But I think I've been here before. I think we've all been here before. I think the photographs might not be of different people after all. The entry ended there, but below it, in fresher ink, was a single sentence in my actual handwriting, written in the careful way I write when I'm trying to be very clear. I don't remember writing the above entry. I ran for the door. It opened onto the catwalk that circled the tower, 40 feet above the rocky slope. The morning was crystalline clear, the kind of perfect mountain day that appears on postcards. I could see for miles in every direction, peaks and valleys and forests stretching to the horizon, beautiful, empty. And that's when I noticed the other towers. There were 5 of them, scattered across distant peaks, each one identical to Tower 9, except they hadn't been there before. In 2 weeks of watching the horizon, I'd memorized every feature of the landscape, and there had been no other towers. But now they stood clear and obvious, metal structures catching the early light. I pulled out my binoculars and focused on the nearest one, maybe 3 miles away. Through the magnification, I could see someone standing in the tower's window, a figure in a green ranger jacket, holding something up to their face, binoculars, looking back at me. I lowered my binoculars and the figure lowered theirs, perfectly synchronized. I raised my left hand and the figure raised their left hand. It was me, standing in another tower, watching myself. I checked each of the other towers. Each one contained a figure that moved when I moved, a perfect mirror of my actions, as if I was simultaneously standing in 5 different places, or the same place, or no place at all. The radio crackled inside the tower, even though I'd unplugged it. My voice came through. Tower 9. This is Tower 9, confirming position. I'm on the catwalk. I can see the other towers now. I understand now. Do you copy? I went back inside, closed the door, locked it. The photographs were still scattered across the floor in chronological order. But there were more of them now, new ones appearing in the gaps, filling in spaces between the years. And they weren't all of different people anymore. Some of them were definitely me. Me in clothes I'd worn yesterday, me with the beard growth I currently had, me in the exact shirt I was wearing right now. The most recent photograph showed me standing on the catwalk with binoculars raised, taken from behind and above, from an angle that would require the camera to be floating in midair. I picked up that photograph and noticed something I'd missed before. The date on the border wasn't June 16th, 2024. It was June 16th, 1952. Then June 16th, 1967. Then June 16th, 1983. Then June 16th, 2001. Then today. The same date across 70 years. The same pose, the same moment, repeating. My phone was in my pack, useless, without signal, but still holding my photos. I pulled it out and scrolled through the images. Pictures from my brother's funeral, photos from our last hiking trip together, selfies from better times. His face, my face, our faces that looked so similar, especially toward the end. There was one photograph I'd taken on his final day when he was barely conscious. I'd held my phone up and captured us both in the frame, him in the hospital bed, me sitting beside it, our faces close together. Looking at it now, I couldn't tell which one of us was dying. I opened the logbook to the first entry ever made in Tower 9, dated June 15th, 1952, written in handwriting I now recognized as identical to mine. Arrived at Tower today, beautiful country, looking forward to the solitude. The previous lookout left a note saying to look down sometimes, not just out. Not sure what that means, but I'll keep it in mind. The same note I'd found, the same confusion, the same beginning. I flipped to the middle of the book to an entry from 1987. My brother died last winter. Cancer. I came up here to get away from the grief. The tower feels safe, isolated in the right way. Another entry from 1974. After my brother's funeral, I needed space, needed to be alone. The tower provides that. From 2001, I became a fire lookout because I wanted to disappear for a while after my brother died. Every entry in the book across 7 decades, written by different hands, but telling the same story. Coming to the mountain after the same loss. Seeking the same isolation. Finding the same photographs. Becoming the same photograph. I looked at the Polaroid collection again, at the way the images nested inward toward that central darkness. And I finally understood what I was seeing. It wasn't different people holding different photographs. It was the same person, the same moment, reflected and compressed across time. Every lookout who'd ever been here was me, or I was them, or we were all iterations of the same isolation, the same grief, the same desire to vanish. The tower didn't collect lonely people. It created them, or revealed them, or caught them in a loop of recursive solitude, where the only escape was to become another photograph that would draw another version of yourself to the mountain, seeking the same impossible peace. The radio spoke in my voice. I understand now. And I did. I understood that I'd been here before, would be here again, was here now in 5 different towers across 5 different peaks. That my brother had died in 1952 and 1974 and 1987 and 2001 and 3 months ago. That I'd climbed this mountain dozens of times seeking isolation, and the isolation had obliged by making me infinite and singular at the same time. The photographs were still appearing, materializing on every surface of the tower, showing me in moments I hadn't yet lived, but would live, had lived, was living. Me arriving at the trailhead, me finding the first photograph, me standing on the catwalk with binoculars, me sitting at the desk writing in the logbook, me holding up a new Polaroid to examine my own face, staring back. I picked up a pen and added my own entry to the logbook, knowing, even as I wrote it, that I'd written it before, that someone else would read it later who was also me, who would also understand too late. If you're reading this and you're the next lookout, I'm sorry. I'm sorry I couldn't warn you properly, but you already know what I'm going to say because you've always known. You came here after your brother died. You came here seeking isolation, and you found it. The complete isolation of being caught in a loop with only yourself, repeated infinitely inward toward a darkness that was always patient enough to wait for you. The photographs don't capture moments. They create them, or they reveal that all moments are the same moment, and we're all standing in the same tower looking out at the same landscape, while something at the center of it all, something that understands solitude better than we ever could, looks back at us through our own eyes. Don't try to leave. You already tried. You're already here. You've always been here. The mountain keeps you. The isolation keeps you. The photographs keep you. And eventually, you'll find this logbook again, read these words again, understand them again, and write them again. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, but welcome to Tower 9. I closed the logbook and looked out the windows at the 5 towers standing on 5 peaks, each one containing a version of me that was writing the same words, closing the same book, looking out at 5 other versions of themselves. The radio crackled. Tower 9, confirming position, beginning watch rotation. Everything is fine. Everything has always been fine. I picked up the binoculars and began my scan of the horizon, looking for smoke, looking for anything unusual, knowing I'd find nothing, but also knowing I'd keep looking, because that's what I did here. That's what I'd always done here. That's what I'd always do. The sun rose higher, and the day began its slow progression toward evening, which would lead to night, which would lead to dawn, which would lead to finding the first photograph again, which would lead to understanding again, which would lead to writing in the logbook again, which would lead to the eternal rotation of watching and waiting and being watched and being waited for. In the pile of Polaroids at my feet, a new image was developing. It showed me sitting at the desk, holding a photograph, staring at a photograph, looking at a photograph that showed me sitting at a desk, holding a photograph, staring at a photograph, looking at a photograph, all the way down to that small darkness at the center, where something patient and ancient and intimate with loneliness looked back through my own eyes. I picked up the radio mic and transmitted to myself. Tower 9. This is Tower 9, confirming position. Beginning watch rotation. Everything is fine. From 5 different towers on 5 different peaks, my voice came back in 5-part harmony. Copy that, Tower 9. Everything is fine. Everything has always been fine. And in that moment, surrounded by infinite images of myself spiraling inward toward that central darkness, I felt the isolation I've been seeking finally complete itself. No brother to grieve, no world to return to, no escape from the perfect solitude of being everywhere and nowhere at once. Just me and the photographs in the darkness at the center and the endless, eternal watch. The mountains stretched out in every direction, beautiful and empty and patient, and I began my scan of the horizon once again, looking for smoke that would never come, waiting for a rescue that had already happened countless times and had never happened at all. Story 4. My name is Catherine Voss, and before last month, I would have told you I was good at my job. I'm 29 years old, been a wildland firefighter and post-fire rehabilitation ranger for the National Forest Service for 7 years. And I've seen what fire does to landscapes. I've walked through forests reduced to ash and bone-white snags. I've mapped erosion patterns in hillsides where every living thing burned away. I've documented the slow, painful recovery of ecosystems learning to rebuild from carbon and char. But I'd never seen fire create something before, not destroy, create. I'm stationed at the North Cascades Ranger District in Washington State, and my specialty is post-fire assessment and restoration. When a wildfire tears through Forest Service land, I'm one of the people who goes in afterward to evaluate damage, plan reseeding efforts, monitor for invasive species, and basically help nature remember how to be a forest again. It's depressing work sometimes, seeing centuries of growth reduced to ash in a matter of days, But it's important work, and I'm good at it, or I was. The Shepherd Creek fire started on August 12th from a lightning strike during a dry thunderstorm. It burned for 11 days, consuming 47,000 acres of old-growth and second-growth forest before a combination of containment lines and changing weather patterns finally knocked it down. 3 firefighters were injured, no fatalities, dozens of structures threatened, but ultimately saved. By wildfire standards, it could have been much worse. I went into the burn zone on September 3rd, 3 weeks after the last embers were extinguished, leading a team of 4. Myself, 2 forestry technicians named Marcus and Jen, and a soil scientist on loan from the university named Dr. Peter Cahill. Our job was to assess damage to the watershed, identify areas at highest risk for erosion and landslides, and create a preliminary restoration plan for the spring planting season. The Shepherd Creek burn zone was typical of high-intensity forest fires in this region. Complete canopy consumption in the hottest areas, islands of surviving green, in places where the fire had moved quickly or found less fuel. The ground was covered in white ash, so deep it felt like walking on snow, and the trees that remained standing were blackened skeletons, their branches gone, their bark consumed, everything reduced to charcoal scaffolding that would collapse over the coming winter. What wasn't typical were the patterns. I noticed them on our second day in the burn zone while documenting a particularly severe area near the fire's origin point. The ash on the ground wasn't uniform. It had formed shapes, patterns that looked almost deliberate, circles and spirals, geometric designs that reminded me of crop circles or mandala art. I photographed several of them, thinking they might be caused by unusual burn patterns or wind distribution during the fire. "You seeing these shapes?" I called to Marcus, who was taking GPS coordinates about 50 yards away. He looked at what I was pointing to, a near-perfect spiral of darker ash within lighter ash, maybe 10 feet in diameter. "Huh, that's weird. Maybe something in the fuel load? Like if there was a coiled rope or hose that burned in place?" It was a reasonable explanation, except there shouldn't have been any human materials this deep in the wilderness. And as I walked further, I found more patterns. Concentric circles, branching fractals, designs that suggested intelligence, or at least something more organized than random combustion. Dr. Cahill was fascinated when I showed him the photographs that evening. "Fire can create surprisingly regular patterns," he said, scrolling through the images on my camera, "especially in areas with uniform fuel distribution. The fire moves outward from ignition points in predictable ways, consuming material in waves. These could be echo patterns from multiple ignition sources. Say, if embers landed in a circular distribution and all ignited simultaneously. But look at this one." I pointed to an image that showed what looked disturbingly like a handprint. 5 radiating lines extending from a central palm, all rendered in gradations of ash. That can't be natural. He studied it for a long moment. Probably just pareidolia. We see patterns and faces in random data because that's how human perception works. Like seeing shapes in clouds. But he sounded uncertain, and I noticed he saved that particular image to his laptop. The patterns continued appearing throughout the burn zone, growing more complex and more numerous the deeper we went. By day 4, we documented over 200 distinct formations, and they were no longer abstract. They were recognizably representational. Handprints, yes, but also what looked like faces in profile, human figures in various poses, animals that might have been deer or elk, and stranger things that defied easy categorization. It's like cave paintings, Jen said, photographing a particularly clear image that resembled a human figure with arms raised. Like someone or something is creating art in the ash. Fire created these, Marcus insisted, but he didn't sound convinced anymore. It has to be fire. What else could it be? That night, camped at the edge of the burn zone where we could still find living trees for shelter, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the patterns, about the increasing complexity and clarity of the images, and I kept thinking about something my grandfather had told me when I first started this job. My grandfather was Tlingit from southeast Alaska, and he'd worked for the Forest Service for 40 years. He'd told me stories about fire that I'd dismissed as folklore, about how fire wasn't just destruction, wasn't just a chemical reaction consuming organic matter. He'd said fire was transformation. Fire was a doorway. Fire was a way for things to pass between states of being. He'd said that in places where fire burned hot enough and fast enough, where it consumed everything in its path with complete totality, it could burn through more than just wood and earth. It could burn through the boundaries between what was and what might be. I'd nodded politely and not really listened, because I was a scientist and he was an old man telling old stories. But now, lying in my sleeping bag with the smell of ash and char still thick in my nostrils, I wished I'd paid more attention. On day 5, we found the first face. Not a pattern in the ash that looked like a face, an actual face, rendered in 3 dimensions on the surface of a burned tree trunk. It was about 4 feet off the ground, approximately life-sized, and it had been formed by differential charring of the wood. The features were distinct. Closed eyes, a nose, a mouth set in a neutral expression, even the suggestion of hair. It looked like someone had carved a relief sculpture and then exposed it to fire that had darkened it perfectly without destroying the detail. We stood in a circle around the tree, none of us speaking, all of us understanding that we were looking at something that shouldn't exist. "This is impossible," Dr. Cahal said finally. "Fire doesn't create. It destroys. It can't form coherent images, especially not in 3 dimensions. It can't." He reached out tentatively, touching the face with one finger. The level of detail here, the precision. This would require conscious intent and fine motor control. Fire doesn't have those things. "Maybe someone carved it before the fire," Jen suggested, "and the fire just revealed it." But there were no tool marks, no evidence of carving. The face was formed entirely from the natural grain and char of the wood, as if the tree itself had decided to express a human visage in its dying moments. Marcus was walking around the tree, examining it from all angles. "Hey, there's something written here." On the opposite side of the trunk, carved much more crudely into the char, were words, "I was Thomas Brenner." I felt my skin go cold. Was, not "I am Thomas Brenner." Past tense, Marcus confirmed, like whoever carved this used to be this person, but isn't anymore. I pulled out my satellite phone. Regular cell service was non-existent in the burn zone, and called back to the ranger station. "I need you to search for any Thomas Brenners who might be connected to the Shepherd Creek fire. Firefighters, evacuees, property owners in the area, anything." It took them 20 minutes to call back. "We've got one hit. Thomas Brenner, age 43, resident of Marble Mount. He was on the initial attack crew when the fire started, suffered severe burns and smoke inhalation trying to protect the structure. He's at Harborview Medical Center in Seattle. Critical condition, medically induced coma, prognosis uncertain. I looked at the face on the tree, the closed eyes, the peaceful expression, the past tense. When did he get injured? August 12th, first day of the fire. He's been in a coma ever since. The date the fire started, the date the lightning struck, and the forest began to burn, and somehow, in the process of that burning, an image of Thomas Brenner's face had been created in the wood of a tree miles from where he'd been injured. "We need to document this," Dr. Cahill said, his scientific training reasserting itself despite the obvious impossibility. "Photograph it from every angle. Take bark samples, measure the depth of the carving. Whatever this is, natural phenomenon or elaborate hoax or something we don't have categories for yet, we need data." We spent 2 hours documenting the tree, and during that time we found 3 more faces on nearby burned trunks. All of them were rendered in the same style: closed eyes, peaceful expressions, distinct features formed by differential charring, and each one had a name carved beneath it in that crude, uncertain script. I was Jennifer Mills. I was Carlos Reyes. I was Susan Chen. I looked up each name. All of them had connections to the Shepherd Creek fire. Jennifer Mills was a homeowner who'd refused to evacuate and died when her house was overrun by flames. Carlos Reyes was a bulldozer operator who'd had a heart attack while cutting fire line and died before the medevac could reach him. Susan Chen was a hiker who'd been caught by the fire in the backcountry and never made it out. 4 names, 4 faces, 4 people who had died in or because of the Shepherd Creek fire, their images somehow burned into the trees by the same fire that killed them. "This is a memorial," Jen said quietly. "Someone is memorializing the dead." "Who?" Marcus asked. "Who could do this? And how?" But we all knew there was no who. There was no person out here carving faces and names into burned trees. There was only fire, only the burn zone, only the strange transformation that had occurred when 47,000 acres of living forest became 47,000 acres of ash and char. I thought about my grandfather's stories again, about fire as transformation, about fire as a doorway. "We should leave," I said. "Document what we found and leave. This isn't a normal post-fire assessment anymore." Dr. Cahill shook his head. "We have a scientific responsibility to investigate this fully. Whatever's happening here, it's unprecedented. We could be witnessing a completely unknown natural phenomenon. Or something that isn't natural at all," I countered. "Something that's actively dangerous." "You think the faces are dangerous? They're just images, wood and char. They can't hurt us." But I wasn't so sure, because as we'd been documenting the faces, I'd noticed something else. The eyes weren't quite closed. There were thin slits visible between the lids, as if the faces were watching us through barely opened eyes. And the mouths, which I'd first thought were neutral, were actually slightly open, as if the faces were preparing to speak. We made camp that night in an area of partial burn, where some living trees remained to provide a sense of normalcy. But none of us slept well. I kept hearing sounds in the burn zone, soft rustling noises that might have been wind moving through the skeletal remains of trees, or might have been something else. Movement where nothing living should be moving. Around 2 a.m., Jen shook me awake. "Cat, You need to see this." I followed her to the edge of our camp, where the burned forest stretched away into darkness. She pointed to the nearest standing snag, maybe 30 yards away, barely visible in the moonlight. There was a face on it. I was certain it hadn't been there when we'd made camp. We approached carefully, flashlights cutting through the darkness. The face was similar to the others we'd found. Closed eyes, peaceful expression, rendered in char and grain. But this one had no name carved beneath it. Instead, the crude script read, "I am becoming." Not past tense, present continuous, something in the process of transformation. "There weren't any faces in this area when we surveyed it earlier," Marcus said, his voice tight with fear. "I mapped every standing tree within 100 yards of our camp. This tree was blank, just regular char." "So either we missed it in our initial survey," Dr. Cahal said, or it appeared tonight," I finished, "while we were sleeping, while we were here." We stood in silence, the implications settling over us like ash. If the faces were still being created, still being formed in the burned wood, then whatever process was generating them was ongoing, active, present. "We're leaving," I said. "First light, we pack up and we get out of the burn zone. We'll report what we found. Let people with better equipment and more resources investigate." No one argued this time. But when dawn came, we discovered we had a problem. Our GPS units were malfunctioning, showing our position as shifting constantly, placing us miles from where we should be. Our compasses spun uselessly, unable to find magnetic north. And when we tried to follow our own trail back the way we'd come, we found that the landscape had changed. The patterns in the ash, those spirals and circles and geometric shapes we documented on our way in, had rearranged themselves. They formed different configurations now, creating pathways that led in directions we hadn't explored, blocking routes we'd previously traversed. It was as if the burn zone itself was reorganizing, reshaping, directing us deeper into its heart rather than allowing us to leave. "This is impossible," Marcus kept saying, a mantra against panic. "Ash doesn't move on its own. Patterns don't change. This is impossible." But we were living in the impossible now, walking through a landscape that had been transformed by fire into something that followed different rules than the forest we'd entered. The faces multiplied as we walked. Every standing tree we passed bore at least one face, and many had multiple faces spiraling up their trunks like a totem pole of the dead. Some we recognized from our earlier documentation: Thomas Brenner, Jennifer Mills, Carlos Reyes, Susan Chen, but most were strangers. Dozens of faces, then hundreds, all rendered in that same style, eyes closed or barely slitted, mouths slightly open, expressions peaceful but somehow expectant. And all of them had inscriptions. Most said, "I was," followed by a name. But increasingly we found ones that said, "I am becoming." "How many people died in this fire?" Jen asked, her voice barely above a whisper. 4 confirmed fatalities, I said. "But these faces, there are hundreds of them, maybe thousands." Dr. Cahal had stopped trying to explain things scientifically. He walked in silence, his face pale, occasionally reaching out to touch a tree or test the solidity of the ground, as if no longer trusting his senses. We walked for hours, following the paths that the ash patterns seemed to allow, moving deeper into the burn zone's interior. The sun was high overhead, but seemed distant, filtered through a haze that might have been smoke or might have been something else. The temperature was wrong. Too cold for September. Cold enough that our breath showed in the air. Cold enough that frost was forming on the charred trees despite the sun. That's when we found the gathering. It was in a natural amphitheater formed by the burned hillsides, a bowl-shaped depression where the fire had burned particularly hot. And every tree, every standing snag, every piece of burned wood large enough to hold an image bore a face. Hundreds of them, thousands of them, all facing inward, all focused on the center of the amphitheater where a single massive tree still stood. It was a Douglas fir that must have been 500 years old. Its trunk, 6 feet in diameter, burned black, but somehow still intact, while everything around it had been reduced to ash. And its trunk was covered in faces. Not dozens, hundreds. They spiraled from the roots to where the crown had been, overlapping and interwoven, a mass of human features rendered in char and wood. Men, women, children, young and old, every ethnic background, every expression ranging from peace to terror to something that might have been ecstasy, all of them compressed into the surface of this one massive tree as if it were a monument or a tomb or a doorway. At the base of the tree, carved in letters 2 feet tall, were the words, "We are becoming." "We need to get out of here," Marcus said, backing away. "We need to run." But Jen was walking forward, drawn to the tree despite the obvious wrongness of it. "Do you hear that?" she asked. I listened. There was a sound, barely audible, like voices whispering or wind moving through leaves that no longer existed. It seemed to come from the tree itself, from the mouths of those thousands of faces, a collective murmur of something that might have been words if I could just listen more carefully. "Jen, stop," I called. "Don't touch it." But she was already at the tree, her hand extended toward the nearest face. "They're trying to tell us something. They're trying to explain." Her fingers made contact with the charred wood, and the whispering stopped. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Jen gasped and went rigid, her hand seemingly fused to the tree, her eyes wide and unseeing. The faces on the tree opened their eyes, all of them simultaneously, thousands of eyes looking in every direction at once. And they spoke. Not with sound exactly, but with something that bypassed ears entirely, injecting meaning directly into our minds. We were consumed. We were transformed. We passed through fire and became something that fire could not destroy. The flames took our bodies, but released what lived within them. We are the memory of what burned. We are the echo of what was lost. We are becoming what comes after. Join us, pass through, transform, become. The invitation was overwhelming, seductive in its certainty. The faces were showing us their peace, their unity, their transcendence. They had died in the fire, but the fire had not ended them. It had changed them, elevated them, given them a new form of existence within the burned landscape. They were offering us the same transformation. I saw Marcus take a step toward the tree, his expression slack, drawn by the same promise. Dr. Cahal was already moving, his hand reaching out toward a face at his eye level. And I understood then what my grandfather had been trying to tell me. Fire wasn't just transformation. It was transmutation. In places where it burned completely, where it consumed everything with total intensity, it could change not just the physical form of things, but their essential nature. It could burn away the boundary between living and dead, between matter and spirit, between what was and what might be. The Shepherd Creek fire had burned so hot, so fast, so completely in this amphitheater that it had created a threshold. And the people who had died in the fire, along with countless others who had died in fires throughout history, their essences somehow drawn to this place, had passed through that threshold into something new. They were inviting us to join them, to touch the tree, to make contact with their collective consciousness, to let the transformation complete itself, to become faces in the wood, peaceful and patient and eternal. No, I said, forcing the word out against the overwhelming pressure of their invitation. No, we're not doing this. I grabbed Marcus's arm, pulled him back. Then I grabbed Dr. Cahill and yanked him away from the tree. Jen was harder. She was fully connected now, her hand seemingly fused to the wood, her eyes open, but showing only white. I had to physically pry her fingers away from the tree, breaking the contact with force that must have hurt her, but she didn't react. The moment her hand came free, the eyes on all those faces closed again. The whispering resumed, and the amphitheater began to fill with smoke, not regular smoke, but something thicker, more present, smoke that moved with purpose and seemed to reach for us. "Run!" I shouted. "Run now!" We ran through the smoke, through the patterns in the ash that tried to redirect us, through the forest of watching faces. Jen was barely conscious, supported between Marcus and me, her hand blistered and blackened where it had touched the tree. Dr. Cahal stumbled behind us, muttering to himself, his scientific framework completely shattered by what we'd witnessed. The smoke followed us, reaching with tendrils that left frost where they touched our skin. The faces on the trees opened their eyes as we passed, watching our escape, their expressions no longer peaceful, but hungry, longing, desperate for us to stop and turn back and accept the invitation to transform. I don't know how long we ran. Time felt wrong in the burn zone, stretched and compressed by turns. But eventually we burst through the edge of the burned area into living forest, into trees that still had bark and leaves, into ground covered with moss and ferns instead of ash and char. The moment we crossed that boundary, everything changed. Our GPS units started working again. Our compasses found north. The temperature returned to normal September warmth. And when we looked back at the burn zone, it looked like any other forest fire aftermath, just trees and ash and char. Nothing supernatural, nothing impossible. But I could still see the faces, if I looked carefully, thousands of them, watching from the burned trees, waiting patiently for the next visitors who might be curious enough, or lost enough, or broken enough to accept their invitation. We made it back to the ranger station by nightfall. Jen's hand required hospitalization. Second-degree burns consistent with touching extremely hot metal, though she insisted the tree had felt cold. Dr. Cahill requested immediate reassignment to a different project and left Washington State entirely within a week. Marcus quit the Forest Service and took a job with a landscaping company in Seattle, refusing to discuss what happened. I wrote the official report, documenting the faces as an unusual natural phenomenon deserving further study. I included photographs and GPS coordinates. I recommended the area be closed to public access pending investigation. The Forest Service sent a team of specialists to examine the site. They found the faces, dozens of them, they said. Interesting examples of pareidolia in char patterns, probably worth a research paper on how humans perceive meaningful images in random data. They took samples, made measurements, and concluded there was nothing dangerous or anomalous about the burn zone. It was cleared for standard post-fire restoration work. I read their report and said nothing, because I knew they hadn't found the amphitheater. They hadn't seen the massive tree with thousands of faces. They hadn't heard the invitation to transform. Either they'd looked and not been worthy of seeing it, or the burn zone had hidden itself from them, showing them only what they expected to see. The faces are still there. I know because I've been back, alone, 3 times now. Each time I find more of them, spreading beyond the original burn zone, appearing on trees that weren't even touched by the Shepherd Creek fire. The transformation is continuing, expanding, reaching beyond the boundaries of where the flames actually burned. And each time I go back, the invitation gets stronger. The faces speak more clearly. The promise of peace and transcendence becomes more seductive. I understand now why Jen couldn't pull her hand away, why Dr. Cahal and Marcus were drawn forward despite their fear. Because part of me wants to accept. Part of me wants to touch that tree, to make contact with that collective consciousness, to understand what it means to pass through fire and become something that fire cannot destroy. Part of me is tired of being Catherine Voss, wildland firefighter and post-fire rehabilitation ranger, tired of being human and limited and separate. Part of me wants to become. I'm writing this account because I don't trust myself anymore. Because yesterday I woke up and found my hand extended toward my campfire, fingers reaching for the flames, and I don't remember doing it. Because sometimes when I look in the mirror, I see my face beginning to flatten, beginning to simplify, beginning to look like those faces in the burned trees. Because last night I dreamed I was back in the amphitheater, and when I touched the tree this time, I didn't pull away. I let the transformation complete itself. I felt my body become wood and char, felt my consciousness merge with the thousands of others who had passed through fire. And it was beautiful. It was peaceful. It was everything they promised. When I woke up, there were words carved into my bedroom wall, crude letters scratched into the wood. I am becoming Catherine Voss. Not past tense, not quite present tense, something in between. I'm leaving the Forest Service. I'm moving to a city far from any forest, far from any place where fire might burn. I'm going to work in an office, surround myself with concrete and steel, live somewhere that has never known wildfire and never will. But I don't think it will matter. Because the faces aren't just in the burn zone anymore. I saw one yesterday on a telephone pole in town. I saw another in the grain of my apartment door. The transformation is spreading. Or maybe I'm carrying it with me. Or maybe once you've been invited to become, you can never really decline. The Shepherd Creek burn zone is scheduled for reforestation in the spring. Thousands of seedlings will be planted among the ash and char. And I wonder if those new trees will grow normally, or if they'll emerge already bearing faces, already offering the invitation to transform, already serving as doorways for fire to burn away the boundary between what is and what might be. I wonder if forests have always done this, in places where fire burns hot enough and complete enough. I wonder if every burn zone is a threshold, every wildfire a doorway, every landscape of ash and char, a place where transformation is possible for those willing to accept it. I wonder how many people throughout history have touched the burned trees and chosen to become. And I wonder, late at night when I can hear the whispering that follows me even here, even far from any forest. How much longer I can resist the invitation before I stop being Catherine Voss and start being whatever comes after. The faces are patient. They have all the time that fire has ever taken, all the time that transformation requires. They're waiting in the burn zone, watching from the trees, whispering their promise of peace and transcendence. And someday soon, I think I'm going to stop running from them and finally go back. Someday soon, I think I'm going to touch that tree and let the transformation complete itself. Someday soon, there will be a new face in the amphitheater, rendered in char and wood, with closed eyes and a slightly open mouth, and words carved beneath it. I was Catherine Voss, and then I am becoming. And finally, when the transformation is complete, we are. The fire is patient. The burned forest is patient. The faces are patient. And they're waiting for me to come home. Story 5. My name is Robert Finch. I'm 47 years old, and I've been the head ranger at Pinewood State Park in northern Maine for the last 19 years. I'm a divorced father of 2. My kids are adults now, living their own lives in cities far from here. And I took this job originally because it came with decent benefits and a house on park property where I could raise them after my ex-wife decided she couldn't handle rural life anymore. The park itself is small by state park standards, just over 8,000 acres of dense pine forest surrounding Lake Miriam, a glacial lake so clear you can see 30 feet down in the summer. We get maybe 20,000 visitors a year, mostly families camping during the summer months, some leaf peepers in the fall, cross-country skiers in winter. It's quiet work, predictable work, the kind of ranger position where the biggest excitement is usually a bear getting into the dumpsters or a drunk fisherman needing to be escorted off the property. I've broken up domestic disputes at campsites, pulled a few people out of the lake who'd underestimated the cold water, and once stopped a small forest fire started by careless campers. Nothing that ever made me question reality or my own sanity. Not until the children started appearing. I need to explain the history first, because context matters. In 1978, Pinewood was the site of a tragedy that's still remembered in the local communities, though it's rarely discussed openly. There was a summer camp here, Camp Miriam, run by the YMCA, that operated from 1952 to 1978. On July 23, 1978, during the final week of the summer session, 13 children between the ages of 8 and 12 went on a nature hike with 2 counselors. They never came back. The search lasted for 3 weeks. They brought in dogs, helicopters, volunteers from every town within 50 miles. They combed every acre of the forest, dragged the lake, checked every cave and ravine and hollow tree. They found nothing. No bodies, no clothing, no equipment, no sign that 15 people had simply vanished into 8,000 acres of pine forest. It was as if they'd stepped off the trail and ceased to exist. The theories ranged from the plausible to the absurd. Abduction by a predator, human or animal. A group fall into some hidden sinkhole or cave system that sealed itself afterward. Mass disorientation leading them outside the search perimeter, where they died of exposure and were scattered by scavengers. The camp director took his own life 2 months after the disappearance. The YMCA closed the camp permanently in 1979. The state acquired the property in 1983 and converted it into a day use and camping park, tearing down most of the old camp buildings, but leaving a few structures that were deemed historically significant. I knew all this when I took the job. Everyone who works at Pinewood knows the story. There's even a small memorial near the old camp dining hall. 15 names carved into a granite stone, dates of birth but no dates of death, because they were never officially declared dead until 7 years had passed. I've taken my hat off at that memorial 100 times, felt the appropriate sadness for a tragedy that happened before I was born, and never thought much more about it. The children started appearing 3 months ago, in late July, almost exactly 46 years after the disappearance, though I didn't make that connection immediately. It was a Tuesday morning, and I was doing a routine patrol of the campground before the afternoon check-ins began. Most sites were empty. It was midweek in the shoulder season, and we only had about 30% occupancy. I was walking past Site 23, which had been vacant the night before, when I saw a girl standing at the edge of the tree line. Oh, she was maybe 10 years old, wearing what looked like clothes from another era, denim shorts, a yellow t-shirt with some kind of logo I couldn't quite make out, canvas sneakers that were stained with dirt and pine needles. Her hair was in braids, and she was completely still, staring into the forest with an expression of intense concentration, as if listening for something. "Hey there," I called out, keeping my voice friendly but concerned. A child alone in the campground was unusual. Parents in state parks tend to keep close watch on their kids. "Are you okay? Where are your parents?" She didn't respond, didn't even turn to acknowledge that I'd spoken, just kept staring into the trees with that focused, listening expression. I approached more closely, my ranger training kicking in. Lost child, possibly in shock, need to establish trust and locate guardians. "My name is Robert. I'm a park ranger. Can you tell me your name?" Still nothing. I was close enough now to see that her clothes, while old-fashioned, weren't dirty or damaged the way they should be if she'd been lost in the woods. They looked clean, almost pristine, like they'd just been washed. And her skin had a strange quality in the morning light, not quite translucent, but not quite solid either, as if she were slightly out of focus, even though everything around her was sharp and clear. I reached out to touch her shoulder, and my hand passed through empty air. She wasn't there, or she was there, but not in a way that allowed physical contact. I jerked my hand back, my heart suddenly hammering, and in that moment of shock and disbelief, she turned to look at me. Her eyes were completely white, no iris, no pupil, just white from edge to edge, and they were looking at me with an expression that might have been curiosity or might have been hunger. I couldn't tell which and didn't want to know. Then she smiled, and I saw that her teeth were stained dark brown, like old blood or rust, and she raised one hand and pointed past me, toward the memorial stone where the names of the lost children were carved. I turned to look, and when I turned back, she was gone. I stood there for maybe 5 minutes, trying to process what I'd just seen, trying to convince myself it had been a trick of the light, or a hallucination brought on by too much coffee and not enough sleep. But I knew what I'd seen. I knew it had been real, or as real as something impossible could be. I spent the rest of the day searching the campground and questioning the few campers who were there. No one had seen a girl matching that description. No one was missing a child. No one had any explanation for what I'd experienced. That night, I pulled out the old records from 1978, the detailed reports from the search, and the list of missing children. The third name on the list was Emily Brennan, age 10, described as wearing denim shorts and a yellow Camp Miriam t-shirt, brown hair in braids. I'd seen Emily Brennan 46 years after she disappeared into the forest and never came back. I should have reported it, should have told my supervisor, should have documented it officially, should have done any number of things that protocol demanded. But I didn't, because I knew how it would sound. I knew I'd be put on mandatory leave, sent for psychological evaluation, possibly lose my job. So I kept quiet and told myself it had been a one-time thing, stress-induced hallucination, nothing to worry about. But 3 days later, I saw another one. This time it was a boy, maybe 9 years old, standing on the dock that extends into Lake Miriam. He was wearing swim trunks and a camp t-shirt, and he was staring down into the water with that same intense, listening expression Emily had worn. I approached more cautiously this time, already knowing what I was going to find. He was translucent in the bright afternoon sun, more ghost than solid, and when I called out to him, he turned with the same white eyes, the same dark-stained smile. He pointed down into the water where I could see nothing but the clear depths of the lake and the rocks on the bottom 30 feet below. Then he stepped off the dock and fell into the lake without a splash, sinking straight down like he was made of stone, and disappeared into the depths. I checked the list again that evening. Michael Torres, age 9, last seen wearing swim trunks and a yellow camp shirt. One of the theories about the disappearance had been that some or all of the children might have drowned in the lake, though the searches had never found any evidence of this. They kept appearing after that, one every few days, always alone, always wearing the clothes they'd disappeared in, always with those terrible white eyes and stained teeth. They'd appear in different locations around the park, on trails, near the old camp buildings, at the edge of the forest, by the lake, always staring at something I couldn't see, always listening to something I couldn't hear, and always, eventually, pointing towards something before they vanished. By the end of August, I'd seen 11 of the 13 missing children. I'd documented each sighting in a private notebook, cross-referencing with the 1978 records, trying to understand what they were and what they wanted, because they clearly wanted something. The pointing was too deliberate, too insistent. They were trying to show me something, guide me somewhere, make me understand something about what had happened to them. The only two I hadn't seen yet were Jacob Chin, age 11, and Sarah Bishop, age 8, the youngest of the group. I also hadn't seen the two counselors, Mark Henderson, 19, and Lisa Stromberg, 20, who'd been leading the hike when everyone disappeared. I didn't know if that was significant or not. It was during this time that I started really researching the disappearance, going beyond the official reports to interview people who'd been there in 1978. Most of them were old now, in their 60s and 70s, but they remembered the search, the fear, the growing certainty that something impossible had happened. The forest felt wrong that summer, one former camp counselor told me. She'd been 19 in 1978, working at Camp Miriam the week the children disappeared. It felt like it was watching us, like the trees had eyes. A bunch of us counselors talked about it, about how the woods seemed darker that year, how sounds didn't carry right, how sometimes you'd hear children's voices from directions where no children were. We thought we were just spooked because of what happened. But looking back, I think the wrongness started before the disappearance. Maybe it caused the disappearance. Another witness, a local man who'd been part of the search party, told me about something he'd never reported officially. On the fourth day of searching, I was with a group checking the north section of the park, near where the old logging roads used to be. We heard singing, children's voices, clear as day, singing some kind of camp song. We all heard it, 6 of us. We followed the sound for maybe 20 minutes, going deeper into the forest. And the whole time the singing stayed the same distance away, like it was moving with us, leading us somewhere. Then one of the guys tripped, and when we stopped to help him up, the singing cut off like someone had flipped a switch. We realized we were standing in a perfect circle of dead trees, maybe 30 feet in diameter. Every tree in that circle was dead or dying, and the ground inside was bare. Nothing growing, no ferns or moss or mushrooms, just bare dirt. And in the center of the circle was a pile of stones, arranged in a pattern that looked deliberate. We didn't tell anyone because we knew how it would sound, but we all saw it, and we all felt like something was watching us from those dead trees, waiting to see what we'd do. I asked if he could take me to that location. He refused. "I've never gone back to those woods," he said, "and neither should you. Some places are marked, and once a place is marked, decent people should stay away." But I couldn't stay away because the children kept appearing, kept pointing, kept trying to show me something. And I kept thinking about what the old counselor had said, that the wrongness had started before the disappearance, not after. In early September, I saw Jacob Chen. He appeared on the main hiking trail, the same one the group had been on when they disappeared in 1978. He was standing at a fork in the path, where the maintained trail continued north, but an old, barely visible trail branched off to the east into a section of the park that was officially designated as backcountry, no maintained trails. Jacob was pointing down that eastern trail, the one that wasn't on any modern maps, but that I knew existed from old surveys. And he was crying, not making any sound, but tears were running down his translucent face, and the expression in those white eyes was pure terror. I understood then. They weren't just showing me where they were. They were showing me where they'd gone. The path they'd taken that led them away from the world of the living and into whatever had claimed them. And they wanted me to follow. I equipped myself properly. GPS, satellite phone, emergency beacon, 3 days of supplies, and a level of determination that was probably equal parts courage and insanity. I informed the assistant ranger that I was doing a backcountry survey and would be out of contact for up to 72 hours. Then I hiked out to the fork in the trail where Jacob had been standing and turned east, following the path that 13 children and 2 counselors had followed 46 years ago. The trail was barely visible, overgrown with decades of vegetation, but it was still there if you knew to look for it. And as I walked, I started to see signs that others had come this way more recently than 46 years ago. Broken branches, disturbed ground, and most tellingly, small objects placed along the trail like trail markers. A child's sneaker, a plastic water bottle from the 1970s, a compass, a friendship bracelet. Breadcrumbs left by the lost children, guiding me deeper into the forest. The woods did feel wrong here, exactly as the old counselor had described. The light was dimmer, despite it being early afternoon. The sounds were muffled, as if I were walking through dense fog, even though the air was clear. And yes, the trees seemed to be watching. I know how insane that sounds, but I could feel their attention on me, patient and hungry and ancient. After about 2 miles, I found the circle of dead trees the searcher had described. It was still there, still dead, a perfect circle, maybe 30 feet across, where nothing living could grow. The pile of stones in the center had been disturbed, scattered, as if someone or something had been searching through them. But the pattern was still partially visible. A spiral, I realized. The stones had been arranged in a spiral pattern. And standing around the edge of the circle, translucent and flickering in the dim light, were all 13 children. They formed their own circle, evenly spaced, all facing inward toward the stones, all wearing the clothes they disappeared in, all with those white eyes and stained teeth, and all pointing inward toward the spiral of stones. I approached slowly, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. "What happened to you?" I asked, not expecting an answer but needing to ask. "Where did you go?" One of them, Emily Brennan, the first one I'd seen, turned to look at me. Her mouth opened, and I heard her voice for the first time. But it wasn't coming from her translucent form. It was coming from the forest itself, from the trees and the ground and the air. A whisper that surrounded me. We followed the singing. We wanted to hear it better. We wanted to find where it was coming from. Mark and Lisa tried to stop us, but the singing was so beautiful and it promised things. It promised we would never have to leave summer. We would never have to go back to school or to parents who didn't understand us or to houses that were lonely. It promised we would stay in the best part of being young forever. So we followed it here to this circle, and the stones were arranged differently then. They made a staircase going down into the ground, down into somewhere that wasn't the forest anymore, but was still here, under here, always here. And we went down the stairs because the singing was loudest there. Mark and Lisa came after us, trying to bring us back, but we were already too far down, already too deep, already becoming part of what was singing. Another voice joined hers, then another, until all 13 children were speaking in that same whisper from everywhere. We've been here ever since, under the forest, in the spaces between the roots and the rocks. We're part of it now, part of what sings in the deep places where the old things live. But we remember being separate. We remember being children with names and families and lives that were supposed to continue. And we want to come back. We want to come up. We want to finish growing up and going to school and having families of our own. But we can't come back unless someone comes down. That's the rule. The old thing that sings, it needs the balance. 15 went down, so 15 must come up. But only if 15 go down to replace them. That's why we've been showing ourselves. That's why we've been pointing. We need you to understand. We need you to bring others. We need 15 people to walk down the stairs so that 15 of us can walk up. The horror of what they were saying settled over me like a shroud. They were trying to lure people into the circle, into whatever existed beneath the spiral of stones, so they could escape. They'd been trapped for 46 years in some nightmare space under the forest, and they were desperate enough to condemn others to the same fate if it meant they could be free. "I can't do that," I said, backing away from the circle. "I can't bring people here to be trapped in your place. That's not salvation. That's just spreading the horror." The whisper grew louder, more insistent, and I could hear the desperation and madness in it. "We're still alive down there. We're 13 years old and 11 years old and 9 years old. And we've been that age for 46 years, trapped in the dark with the singing and the old thing that feeds on youth and summer and the best parts of being young. We want to grow up. We want to grow old. We want to die eventually, as old people with grandchildren, not stay forever young in the dark. Please, please help us. Bring others. Make the trade. Let us come back. I kept backing away, my hands shaking, my mind reeling with the impossibility and the cruelty of their situation. They were victims, but they were also trying to create new victims. They were suffering, but they wanted to pass that suffering on to others. The moral calculus was impossible, and I wouldn't be part of it. I'm sorry, I said. I'm so sorry for what happened to you, but I can't help you this way. Their translucent forms began to solidify, becoming more real, more present, and I realized with mounting terror that if I stayed in the circle much longer, they might be able to touch me, might be able to drag me down into the spaces under the forest where they'd been trapped. I ran back along that overgrown trail, following the breadcrumb objects they'd left. GPS be damned. I ran, while behind me I heard children's voices raised in anger and despair, calling my name, begging me to come back, promising things I knew they couldn't deliver. I ran until I reached the main trail, and even then I kept running until I was back at the ranger station, back in the world of maintained paths and designated campsites and normal human concerns. I locked myself in my house and spent 3 days trying to decide what to do. Report it? To whom? Tell a story about ghost children in spiral staircases under the forest? Seal off that section of the park? On what grounds? Close the entire park based on what evidence? In the end, I did the only thing I could think of. I went back to that fork in the trail where Jacob Chen had been standing, and I built a barrier. Not a physical barrier that would just invite curious hikers to go around it, but a psychological one. I put up a sign, "Trail closed, dangerous conditions. No entry by order of park management." I made the eastern trail look impassable, dragging fallen logs across it, creating the impression that it hadn't been used in decades. And I've been watching ever since, watching for anyone who might be drawn to that trail despite the warnings, watching for the children who still appear occasionally, though less frequently now, always staring at me with accusation and desperate hope in their white eyes, watching for any sign that the thing under the forest, the thing that sings and promises eternal summer and feeds on youth, might be trying to reach out beyond its circle of dead trees. It's been 3 months since I found the circle, 3 months since I heard the children's story and refused to help them the only way they claimed I could. I dream about them every night. I see Emily Brennan standing at the edge of my yard, pointing toward the forest. I see Michael Torres in the lake, beckoning me to follow him down into the depths. I see all 13 of them arranged in their circle, waiting patiently for me to change my mind. And 2 weeks ago, I saw something new. I saw Mark Henderson, the 19-year-old counselor who'd gone down into the spiral with the children, trying to bring them back. He appeared on my porch at 2 a.m., solid enough that I could see him clearly through the window, wearing the same clothes he'd disappeared in 46 years ago. But his eyes weren't white like the children's. They were normal, brown and human, and filled with a sanity that made him somehow more terrifying than the children. He knocked on my door, not a ghost knock, but a real physical sound that left marks in the condensation on the glass. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I just watched as he stood there for 5 minutes, then pulled a piece of paper from his pocket and pressed it against the window so I could read it. The message was written in handwriting that was precise and careful.